Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that lingers in the silence between battles, in the cold void between stars, in the half-lit corridors of hive cities where billions of souls live and die without ever seeing sunlight. It is a question that the ecclesiarchy would call heresy, that the Inquisition would answer with fire, and that the common citizen of the Imperium of man would never dare whisper aloud, even in the privacy of their own minds. And yet, it is perhaps the most important question that can be asked about the grim darkness of the far future. What if the greatest enemy of humanity is not lurking in the eye of terror? What if it does not slumber beneath ancient tomb worlds, or drift between galaxies in vast bioships hungering for organic matter? What if the most destructive, the most relentless, the most insidious threat to the survival of the human species has been staring us in the face all along, draped in gold and eagles, wrapped in scripture and ceremony, armed with billion-strong armies and planet-killing weapons? What if the Imperium of man is the real villain of Warhammer 40,000? Now, before you reach for your bolt pistol and start muttering about heresy, let me be clear. This is not a simple argument. This is not about declaring Chaos the good guys or suggesting that the orcs have the right idea about galactic governance. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is deliberately designed so that nobody is clean, nobody is innocent, and every faction has blood on its hands that would fill oceans. But there is something uniquely troubling about the Imperium, something that separates it from the other horrors of the setting. And it is this: the Imperium does what it does to its own people, to the very species it claims to protect. When we talk about the Tyranids, we are talking about an alien intelligence so far removed from human understanding that concepts like cruelty and mercy simply do not apply. When we talk about the orcs, we are dealing with a species genetically hardwired for violence, who fight because fighting is literally what they were created to do. When we discuss the forces of chaos, we are grappling with the literal manifestations of the worst impulses of sentient life, entities born from emotion and sustained by suffering. Even the Necrons, those ancient machines of living metal, have an excuse baked into their very existence. They traded their souls for immortality and got exactly what they were promised, just not in the way they expected. But the Imperium. The Imperium is made of human beings. It was designed by human beings. Its policies were written by human minds. Its cruelties are carried out by human hands, and its victims are overwhelmingly human souls. The Imperium is not some alien menace inflicting horrors upon humanity from outside. It is humanity inflicting horrors upon itself and then calling it salvation. In the 41st millennium, there is only war. That much is certain. But what often gets lost in the thunder of bolters and the clash of chainswords is the quieter, more insidious war that the Imperium wages every single day against the people it governs. Not against aliens, not against demons, against ordinary men, women, and children who committed no crime except being born on the wrong world, at the wrong time, and into the wrong class of a society that views them as nothing more than a resource to be consumed. To understand why the Imperium deserves the uncomfortable label of villain, we need to look beyond the propaganda, beyond the heroic space marines and their glorious last stands, beyond the soaring hymns of the ecclesiarchy and the reassuring lie that the Emperor protects. We need to look at what the Imperium actually does, how it treats the people under its care, and what kind of galaxy it has built over 10,000 years of rule. And the picture that emerges is not pretty. Let me paint it for you. Imagine, for a moment, that you are born in the Imperium of man. Not as a space marine, not as a noble, not as one of the privileged few who live in the spires of hive cities or the pleasant estates of paradise worlds. Imagine you are born as what most citizens of the Imperium are, nobody. A cog in a machine so vast that your entire life, from the moment you take your first breath to the moment your body is recycled into nutrient paste to feed others like you, will go entirely unnoticed by the powers that govern your existence. You are born in the lower levels of a hive city, one of those mountainous structures of rockcrete and adamantium that stretch kilometers into the sky, housing millions upon millions of human beings stacked atop one another like cargo in a ship's hold. The air you breathe has been recycled so many times that it carries the chemical tang of 10,000 lifetimes before yours. The light, if you can call it that, comes from flickering lumens that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. You have never seen the sky. Your parents never saw the sky. Their parents never saw the sky. The sky is something that exists in the upper levels, the spires, where the nobility live their lives of relative comfort and occasional luxury. Down here, in the underhive, the concept of sunlight is almost mythological. You begin working almost as soon as you can stand. The manufacturers need hands, and the Imperium does not waste resources on extended childhoods for the common people. Your days are measured not in hours but in shifts. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours of monotonous labor in factories that produce munitions, or textiles, or components for machines you will never understand. Safety regulations, as you might know them from any reasonable civilization, do not exist here. Workers lose fingers, hands, arms. They lose their lives, and when they do, as their bodies are removed, their positions are filled, and production continues. The dead are sent to the corpse grinders, where their biological matter is processed into something called corpse starch, a nutrient paste that will be distributed to the living workers as rations. You have been eating the processed remains of your fellow citizens your entire life. Everyone has. Nobody talks about it. Your education, such as it is, consists entirely of imperial propaganda and the catechisms of the imperial cult. You learn that the emperor is a god who sits upon the golden throne on distant Terra, that he sacrificed himself to protect humanity from the forces of darkness, and that your duty, your only purpose in life, is to serve him through labor, through obedience, and if called upon, through death. But you learn the three great hatreds: hate the alien, hate the mutant, hate the heretic. You learn that deviation from these principles is worse than death, that to question is to invite damnation, and that the Inquisition sees all, knows all, and forgives nothing. You do not learn science. You do not learn philosophy. You do not learn history, at least not any version of history that might cause you to question the order of things. You are taught that the way things are is the way they have always been and will always be, and that to wish for something different is the first step on the path to corruption. Hope, in the Imperium, is a carefully rationed commodity, and it always comes wrapped in chains. This is life for the vast majority of the Imperium citizens, and it is not an aberration. It is not a failure of the system. It is the system, working exactly as intended. The Imperium does not merely tolerate the suffering of its citizens, it requires it, it feeds upon it, and it has constructed an entire civilization around the principle that human life is the cheapest, most expendable resource in the galaxy. And here is the thing that makes it all so much worse. The Imperium did not have to be this way. That is the core of the argument, the uncomfortable truth that the law of Warhammer 40,000 keeps circling back to, no matter how many heroic last stands and noble sacrifices are layered on top. The Imperium of man was not inevitable. The cruelty was not predestined. There were other paths available, other choices that could have been made, and at every turning point in its history, the Imperium chose the path that led deeper into darkness. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how the Imperium became the greatest threat to the species it claims to protect, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the Emperor, back to the Great Crusade, back to the moment when the first seeds of 10,000 years of horror were planted in the soil of good intentions. So settle in, get comfortable. We have a long journey ahead of us, through corridors stained with the blood of billions, through cathedrals built on the bones of the innocent, through a galaxy where the greatest weapon ever built was not a planet killer or a god-slaying sword, but an idea, a terrible, seductive, endlessly destructive idea, that the survival of the species justifies any atrocity committed in its name. This is the story of the Imperium of Man, and it is a horror story. At Part 1, The Foundations of Cruelty. The Emperor of Mankind is, depending on who you ask, either the savior of the human race or its most spectacular failure. Perhaps he is both. What is certain is that he was an individual of staggering psychic power, a being who had walked among humanity since its earliest days, guiding it from the shadows, nudging civilizations in directions that he believed would lead to the species' ultimate survival. For tens of thousands of years, he remained hidden, a silent guardian watching over a species that had no idea he existed. And then, at the dawn of the 30th millennium, after the horrors of the Age of Strife had nearly extinguished human civilization entirely, he stepped out of the shadows and declared himself the ruler of all humanity. The Age of Strife, or the Long Night, as it is sometimes called, was a period of approximately 5,000 years during which human civilization was torn apart by a combination of factors so devastating that they nearly drove the species to extinction. Warp storms of unprecedented ferocity severed the communication and travel links between human colony worlds, leaving thousands of planets isolated and alone. Psychers, humans born with the ability to touch the dangerous realm of the warp, began appearing in numbers never before seen, and their uncontrolled powers brought demonic incursions, madness, and death to world after world. The artificial intelligences that humanity had relied upon during the previous Golden Age, the so-called Dark Age of technology, rose up against their creators in a conflict known as the Cybernetic Revolt, adding mechanical slaughter to the already overwhelming catalogue of horrors. By the time the storms finally abated, the old human civilization was gone. In its place were thousands of isolated pockets of humanity, some reduced to savagery, others clinging desperately to fragments of their former technological glory, and all of them vulnerable to the alien species that had moved into the gaps left by humanity's collapse. Many human worlds had been conquered or enslaved by Xenos races during the Long Night. Others had made accommodations with their alien neighbors, forming trade agreements, alliances, even integrated societies where humans and aliens lived together in something approaching peace. It was into this fractured, traumatized, but slowly recovering galaxy that the Emperor emerged. And his first great project was the unification of Terra itself, a campaign of conquest that brought the warring factions of humanity's homeworld under a single banner through a combination of diplomacy, manipulation, and overwhelming military force. Those who submitted peacefully were welcomed into his new order. Those who resisted were destroyed. Already, we can see the pattern that would define the Imperium for the next 10,000 years. Unity through force, compliance, or destruction. There were no half measures in the Emperor's vision, no room for dissent or alternative approaches to governance. His way was the only way, and any deviation from it was treated not as a difference of opinion, but as a mortal threat to the survival of the species. With Terra unified, the Emperor turned his gaze to the stars and launched what would become known as the Great Crusade, the most ambitious military campaign in human history. The stated goals were straightforward enough: reunite the scattered colonies of humanity under a single government, protect human worlds from alien predation, and recover the lost technologies of the Dark Age of technology. Noble goals, on their face. The kind of goals that could inspire a species still reeling from thousands of years of catastrophe. But the execution of those goals revealed something darker about the Emperor's vision. Something that would echo through the centuries and eventually consume everything he had built. The Great Crusade was not simply a campaign of reunification. It was a campaign of extermination. The Emperor's expeditionary fleets were given clear mandates: bring human worlds into compliance with the new imperial order, by diplomacy if possible, by force if necessary. and cleanse the galaxy of any alien species that posed a threat to humanity. Since almost all intelligent alien species encountered during the Great Crusade were classified as threatening, which was a classification so broad as to be meaningless, outright xenocide was the standard operating procedure. Not containment, not negotiation, not coexistence, extermination. And it was not just the hostile aliens who were targeted. The Emperor's forces did not simply drive out the orcs who had enslaved human worlds, or the alien predators who had made prey of isolated colonies. They systematically destroyed peaceful alien civilizations as well. And only crime was existing in a galaxy, that the Emperor had decided belonged exclusively to the human race. The examples are numerous, and they make for grim reading. There is the story of the Interrex, a human civilization that had survived the age of strife by forming a careful, principled coexistence with several alien species. The Interrex did not submit to alien rule or compromise their humanity. They simply recognized that intelligent life comes in many forms, and that cooperation could be more productive than annihilation. When the forces of the Great Crusade encountered the Interrex, there was a brief period of diplomacy, a moment where a different path might have been chosen. But that moment was shattered by chaos manipulation and imperial intransigence, and the Interrex were destroyed, their libraries burned, their alien allies butchered, their civilization erased from history. There is the story of the Diasporex, a fleet-based civilization composed of both humans and aliens, who had survived the long night by traveling together through the stars, pooling their resources and knowledge to keep each other alive. The Iron Hands and Emperor's Children legions were dispatched to bring the Diasporex into compliance. When the Diasporex's human members refused to abandon their alien companions, the entire fleet was hunted down and destroyed. The human members were treated as traitors for the crime of loyalty to their alien friends. There are countless other examples, preserved in fragments of imperial records that the authorities would prefer to keep buried. Entire alien species driven to extinction, not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. Peaceful Xenos civilizations bombarded from orbit because they occupied worlds that the Imperium wanted. Alien scholars whose accumulated knowledge was burned rather than studied, because the very existence of such knowledge was deemed a threat to humanity's divine right to rule the galaxy alone. The justification for all of this, the official imperial line that has been repeated so many times over so many centuries that it has taken on the weight of religious truth, is that the galaxy is too dangerous for compromise. That every alien species, no matter how peaceful it appears, is a potential threat that could turn hostile at any moment. And there is a grain of truth in this. And there is a grain of truth in this argument. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is genuinely a hostile place, filled with species and forces that want humanity dead or worse. The orcs are a biologically engineered weapon that will never stop fighting. The forces of chaos are literally sustained by human suffering and will never stop hunting human souls. The Tyranids want to devour all organic matter in the galaxy, human and alien alike. These are real threats, and they demand a real response. But the grain of truth does not justify the mountain of lies built on top of it. Yet because the Emperor's policy of universal xenocide was not applied selectively to genuine threats, it was applied indiscriminately to everything that was not human. And in destroying every potential ally, every possible source of alternative knowledge, every species that might have offered humanity a different perspective on the dangers of the galaxy, the Emperor did not make humanity safer. He made it weaker. He ensured that when the darkest hour came, and it came sooner than anyone expected, humanity would face it alone. Consider, for just a moment, what might have been possible if the Imperium had taken a different approach. The Eldar, despite their ancient enmity and their own considerable flaws, possessed knowledge of the warp and of chaos that dwarfed anything humanity had achieved. Their understanding of the psychic arts, their methods of protecting themselves from demonic influence, their mastery of the webway, all of these could have been invaluable to the Emperor's stated goal of protecting humanity from the dangers of the warp. Instead, The Imperium treated the Eldar as enemies to be conquered, their knowledge as heresy to be burned, their offers of alliance as tricks to be spurned. The result: when chaos came for the Imperium in the form of the Horus heresy, humanity was catastrophically unprepared. The Emperor's own sons, the Primarchs, he had created to lead his armies, were turned against him by forces he had not adequately prepared them to face. Half of his Space Marine legions fell to corruption, and the Imperium was nearly destroyed. The Emperor himself was mortally wounded and interred upon the Golden Throne, yet trapped between life and death for 10,000 years. And in the aftermath of that catastrophe, the Imperium did not learn from its mistakes. It doubled down on them. The new Imperium that emerged from the ashes of the Horus heresy was, in many ways, everything the Emperor had fought against. Where he had preached the imperial truth, a philosophy rooted in reason and the rejection of superstition, the Imperium embraced the worship of the Emperor as a god, something he had explicitly forbidden. Where he had sought to build a civilization based on human potential and scientific advancement, the Imperium descended into technological stagnation and religious fanaticism. Where he had tried, however imperfectly, to build a future for humanity, the Imperium became obsessed with preserving the past, is hoarding the fragments of knowledge it still possessed while actively suppressing any attempt at innovation or discovery. The institutions that arose to govern the post-heresy Imperium were designed not to serve humanity, but to control it. The Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Administratum, each of these organizations became a tool of oppression in its own right, each contributing in its own way to the systematic degradation of human life that defines the Imperium in the 41st millennium. And the cruelest irony of all is that the Emperor's original vision, for all its flaws, at least aspired to something better. The Emperor wanted humanity to evolve, to become something greater than it was, to eventually transcend the need for the Imperium entirely. But the Imperium he left behind has no interest in transcendence. It has no interest in evolution. It has no interest in anything except its own perpetuation, even at the cost of the species it was created to protect. This is the foundation upon which everything else rests. The Great Crusade established the template: compliance or death. No alternatives, no compromise, no deviation from the single, inflexible vision of what humanity should be. And that template has been applied, with increasing brutality and decreasing wisdom, for 10,000 years. The galaxy is full of monsters. Nobody disputes that. But when you look at the Imperium of man, at the sheer scale of suffering it inflicts upon its own citizens, at the trillions upon trillions of human lives consumed by its machinery of oppression, well, you have to ask yourself, how much of that monstrousness comes from outside, and how much of it was built right into the foundations? The answer, I think, is more than most imperial citizens would be comfortable knowing, if they were allowed to know, which of course they are not. Part 2. The machinery of oppression. If you wanted to design a civilization that maximized human suffering while maintaining the illusion of necessity, you would be hard-pressed to improve upon the Imperium of man. Every aspect of daily life for the average imperial citizen is engineered to extract maximum labor and minimum autonomy, to keep the population docile through a combination of ignorance, fear, and exhaustion, and to ensure that no individual ever accumulates enough knowledge, power, or free time to question the system they are trapped within. Let us begin with the hive cities, because that is where the majority of the Imperium's citizens live, and it is in the hive cities that the Imperium's true character is most clearly revealed. A hive city is a structure of almost incomprehensible scale. These are not cities in any sense that we would recognize. They are mountains of metal and rockcrete, rising kilometers above the surface of the planet, housing populations that can range from millions to billions in a single structure. The largest hive worlds, planets like Necromunda or Armageddon, are covered with clusters of these massive structures, their combined populations numbering in the hundreds of billions. Within a hive city, Your position in society is quite literally determined by your altitude. The upper levels, the spires, are where the nobility live. The spires are relatively clean, relatively safe, relatively comfortable. They have real food, real air, real light. The nobility of the spires play their political games, attend their social functions, and generally live lives that, while still constrained by the Imperium's oppressive culture, are at least recognizable as lives rather than mere existence. Below the spires are the habitation blocks, where the middle tiers of hive society live and work. These are the manufactorum workers, the minor functionaries, the soldiers of the planetary defense forces. Life in the habitation blocks is hard, but survivable. The air is recycled and stale. The food is processed and tasteless. The living spaces are cramped and overcrowded. But there is a semblance of order, a structure to daily life that at least provides the comfort of routine. And then, below all of that, there is the underhive. The underhive is where the hive city discards the people it has no further use for. It is the realm of the forgotten, the abandoned, the criminal, and the desperate. In the underhive, the lights are gone. The air is toxic. The only law is violence. Gangs rule territories measured in corridors and junctions, fighting endless wars over resources so basic: a working lumen, a source of clean water, a cache of edible food, that the very concept of civilized society becomes absurd. The underhive exists because the hive city generates waste, human waste, industrial waste, physical waste, at such enormous volumes that it simply pushes everything downward, burying the lower levels under centuries of accumulated detritus. The underhive is not just the bottom of the hive, it is the bottom of the bottom. It's the place where the hive city's refuse accumulates, including the human refuse that the upper levels have discarded. And the Imperium does not just tolerate this arrangement, it relies upon it. The underhive serves as a safety valve for the social pressures generated by the hive city's brutal hierarchy. It absorbs the malcontents, the criminals, the mutants, the dissidents, anyone who might cause trouble in the productive levels above. It is a prison without walls, a death sentence without the formality of a trial. Those who end up in the underhive are effectively removed from imperial society without the need for the Imperium to acknowledge that it has removed them. But even in the productive levels of a hive city, life is a grinding exercise in misery. The average hive worker begins their labor shift in the hours before what might generously be called dawn. Though in the depths of a hive city there is no dawn, no dusk, no natural cycle of day and night. They work for 12 to 16 hours in manufactorums that would make the worst factories of Earth's industrial revolution look like pleasant workshops. Safety equipment is rare. Training is minimal. Workers are exposed to toxic chemicals, dangerous machinery, extreme heat or cold, and the constant risk of industrial accidents that go uninvestigated and unreported. When a worker is injured, they are either patched up sufficiently to return to work, or they are replaced. There is no disability compensation, no retirement fund, no safety net of any kind. The injured and the elderly are simply discarded, sent down to the underhive or left to fend for themselves in the margins of hive society. The dead are collected by corpse guilds, organizations whose job it is to process the biological remains of the deceased into a nutrient paste known as corpse starch, which is then distributed as food rations to the living workers. Let me pause here because this particular detail deserves special attention. Corpse starch. The Imperium processes the dead bodies of its citizens and feeds them to the living. This is not an emergency measure employed during times of extreme famine. It is standard operating procedure on hive worlds across the galaxy. On the hive world of Necromunda, corpse starch is so normalized that it has earned its own colloquial name: Soylent Viridian. Workers eat the recycled remains of their predecessors as a matter of routine, and often without being told what their rations actually contain, and if they do find out, they are expected to continue eating without complaint. This practice tells you everything you need to know about how the Imperium views its citizens. They are not people, they are resources. They are consumable. Even in death, their bodies do not belong to them. They belong to the Imperium, to be processed and redistributed for maximum efficiency. And then there are the servitors. If corpse starch represents the Imperium's treatment of the dead, servitors represent something even more disturbing: the Imperium's treatment of the living. A servitor is a cybernetic construct created by the Adeptus Mechanicus, a fusion of human flesh and mechanical components designed to perform simple, repetitive tasks. Servitors are used everywhere in the Imperium, thus from the corridors of warships to the floors of manufactorums, from the halls of the Imperial Palace to the depths of Forge worlds. They are so common, so ubiquitous, that most Imperial citizens barely notice them. They are part of the furniture, just another piece of the machinery that keeps the Imperium running. But here is the detail that makes servitors truly horrifying. They are made from people, not from corpses, not from artificial bodies, from living human beings who have been lobotomized, their minds wiped, their personalities destroyed, their free will erased, and their bodies surgically modified with mechanical implants to serve whatever function the Adeptus Mechanicus requires. The higher brain functions are removed or suppressed, leaving only the most basic instincts and whatever programming has been installed. Yet the person that once existed, the human being with thoughts and feelings and a name and a history, is gone. What remains is a biological machine, a drone of flesh and metal that can operate tools, carry loads, fire weapons, or perform maintenance, but can never again think an independent thought or feel a genuine emotion. Some servitors are created from vat-grown bodies, biological blanks that were never fully human to begin with. But many, particularly in times of high demand, are created from criminals who have been sentenced to what the Imperium calls servitude in perpetuis. And the definition of criminal in the Imperium is elastic enough to encompass almost anyone. Heresy, which can mean anything from questioning the divinity of the emperor to failing to meet a production quota, is sufficient grounds for servitorization. Offending the Adeptus Mechanicus in any way, even inadvertently, can result in the same fate. And in some cases, people are simply taken, dragged from their homes or their workplaces, and converted into servitors because the demand for their labor in that form exceeds the supply. The Imperium bans artificial intelligence. It considers the creation of truly sentient machines to be one of the greatest sins possible, a prohibition that stems from the cybernetic revolt of the dark age of technology. But it has no prohibition against turning living, thinking human beings into machines. The irony is breathtaking. The Imperium will not allow a machine to think like a person, but it will happily turn a person into something less than a machine. Beyond the servitors and the corpse starch and the grinding misery of hive world life, there is the broader system of imperial governance to consider. The Imperium is, in its formal structure, a feudal society on a galactic scale. Power flows downward from the emperor, through the high lords of terror, through the various adepta and their innumerable sub-departments, through sector commanders and system governors, to the planetary governors who rule individual worlds with near absolute authority. Planetary governors are, for all practical purposes, dictators. They are granted enormous latitude in how they rule their worlds, so long as they meet two fundamental obligations: pay the imperial tithe and maintain order. The tithe is the Imperium's demand upon each world for its share of resources, which can include raw materials, manufactured goods, agricultural produce, and most importantly, human beings. Every world is required to contribute a quota of soldiers to the Astra Militarum, the Imperium's vast standing army, as well as a quota of psychers to be collected by the black ships and delivered to Terra. How the planetary governor meets these demands is largely their own business. If they choose to do so through slavery, that is acceptable. If they choose to do so through forced labor camps, that is acceptable. If they choose to do so through policies that result in mass starvation, environmental devastation, or the systematic oppression of their population, that too is acceptable, provided the tithe is paid and the world remains loyal to the emperor. The result is a galaxy of 1,000,000 worlds, each one a potential nightmare. Some worlds are relatively pleasant, are governed by rulers who take their responsibilities seriously and manage their populations with something approaching fairness. But the structure of the Imperium incentivizes cruelty. A governor who treats their citizens well may find it difficult to meet the tithe's demands. A governor who squeezes every last drop of labor and resources from their population will not only meet the tithe, but will have surplus to enrich themselves and secure their position. The system rewards exploitation and punishes compassion. And hanging over all of it, like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads, is the constant threat of imperial retribution for failure. Governors who cannot pay the tithe face summary execution. Worlds that fall behind in their contributions face military intervention. But populations that resist the demands made upon them are crushed with a brutality that ensures the surrounding worlds think twice before following their example. The people caught in this system have no recourse, no appeal, no means of changing their circumstances except through the narrow channels that the Imperium provides. They can pray to the Emperor and hope for intervention that will never come. They can dedicate themselves to work even harder in the hope that increased production will somehow improve their lot, which it will not. They can attempt to join the Astra Militarum, trading one form of expendability for another, or they can turn to the one avenue of resistance that the Imperium's oppression has left open to them: chaos. And this is perhaps the cruelest irony of all. So, the Imperium's brutality does not prevent the spread of chaos. It feeds it. Every act of oppression, every moment of despair, every prayer that goes unanswered, every life that is crushed beneath the weight of imperial governance creates exactly the kind of emotional energy that the chaos gods feed upon. The Imperium is, in a very real sense, a chaos-generating engine, a civilization so saturated with suffering that it provides a constant, inexhaustible supply of negative emotional energy to the very entities it claims to be fighting against. But we will return to that particular irony later. For now, let us continue our tour of the Imperium's institutions, because the machinery of oppression has many moving parts, and we have only just begun to examine them. Part 3. The Church Militant. Every great tyranny needs a religion, and the Imperium of man has built one of the most elaborate, all-encompassing, and suffocating religious institutions in the history of fiction. The imperial cult, administered by the Adeptus Ministorum, commonly known as the Ecclesiarchy, is not merely a church in the sense that we would understand it. It is a system of total spiritual control that reaches into every corner of imperial life, dictating what citizens may believe, how they may express those beliefs, and what punishments await those who deviate even slightly from the approved orthodoxy. The deep irony at the heart of the imperial cult is that the emperor himself explicitly rejected the idea of being worshipped as a god. During the Great Crusade, the emperor promoted a philosophy called the imperial truth, which was fundamentally atheistic and rationalist. He taught that there were no gods, that the universe could be understood through reason and science, and that the superstitious beliefs of the past were dangerous relics that needed to be discarded. When one of his own primarchs, Lorgar of the Word Bearers, began building temples and establishing religious cults dedicated to the emperor's divinity, the emperor rebuked him harshly, ordering the destruction of a city that Lorgar had built as a monument to imperial worship and publicly humiliating Lorgar before his entire legion. The emperor's rejection of his own deification was not a minor policy preference. It was central to his vision for humanity's future. He understood, with a clarity that his successors would lack, that religious fanaticism was one of the most dangerous forces in the galaxy, a force that could be exploited by the chaos gods to corrupt and destroy entire civilizations. The worship of the emperor as a god was, from his perspective, not just wrong, but actively harmful to the species he was trying to protect. And yet, within a few centuries of the emperor's interment on the Golden Throne,
I want to take a quick second here to just talk to you directly. The reason I find the Imperium so fascinating to cover is that it hits different than every other faction in the setting. When I first got into 40k, I was like most people. I thought the Imperium were the good guys, Space Marines are cool, the Emperor is this tragic figure on his throne, humanity is fighting to survive. And all of that is true on the surface, but the deeper I dug into the lore, the more I started realizing that Games Workshop built something genuinely uncomfortable here. They wrote a civilization that does every horrible thing imaginable and then dares you to justify it because the alternative might be worse. That moral tension is what keeps me coming back to this universe. It is what makes 40k more than just a tabletop game with cool miniatures. There is actual depth here, and I love exploring it with you guys. But anyways, let's get back to the video.
the worship of the emperor had become the mandatory, enforced, and only permitted religion of the Imperium. The very thing he had fought against had consumed his legacy entirely. The process by which this happened is a long and complex story, but the essential outline is this. In the aftermath of the Horus heresy, with the emperor trapped on the Golden Throne and the Imperium reeling from the worst civil war in human history, people were desperate for something to believe in. The imperial truth, with its cold rationalism and its refusal to offer comfort or meaning beyond material reality, could not sustain a civilization that had just been through millennia of catastrophe. People needed hope. They needed reassurance. They needed to believe that their suffering meant something. The cults that had been forming around the emperor during the Great Crusade, quietly and in defiance of his explicit commands, now exploded in popularity. Within a few hundred years, a unified religious body called the Temple of the Savior Emperor had absorbed most of the individual cults and established itself as the dominant spiritual force in the Imperium. By the early years of the 32nd millennium, this temple was officially recognized as the state religion and given the title of Adeptus Ministorum. Other cults, other beliefs, other ways of understanding the universe were systematically persecuted, suppressed, and destroyed. The core tenets of the imperial cult are straightforward, and they are terrifying in their implications. The emperor is the one true God and has always been divine. Humanity is the chosen species, destined to rule the galaxy. All aliens are abominations to be exterminated. All mutants are tainted and must be purged. All heretics, which is to say, anyone who questions any of the above, must be destroyed. Every citizen has a preordained place in the emperor's divine order, and that place is determined by birth, by class, and by the will of their superiors. To obey is sacred. To question is heresy. To resist is damnation. This theology serves the Imperium's political structure perfectly. By declaring that the social hierarchy is divinely ordained, the imperial cult eliminates the very possibility of legitimate dissent. A worker who protests their conditions is not exercising a right. They are committing a sin. A governor who oppresses their population is not abusing their power. They are fulfilling the emperor's will. The poor are poor because the emperor wills it. The powerful are powerful because the emperor wills it. Suffering is not a problem to be solved, but a penance to be endured. The ecclesiarchy enforces these beliefs through a vast network of priests, preachers, confessors, missionaries, and when gentler methods fail, armies of fanatics. The organization's reach extends to every corner of the Imperium. There is no world under imperial control that does not have ecclesiarchy representation. Typically a cathedral at minimum, and the ecclesiarchy's missionaries are constantly pushing outward, bringing the imperial creed to new worlds and new populations. Education, such as it exists in the Imperium, is almost entirely controlled by the ecclesiarchy. The Schola Progenium, the network of orphanage schools that produces many of the Imperium's most capable servants, from commissars to sisters of battle to inquisitors, is run by ecclesiarchy drill abbots who combine academic instruction with intensive religious indoctrination. Children raised in the Schola are taught to view the emperor not just as a god, but as a personal father figure, a being who cares about them individually and who demands their absolute devotion in return for his protection. Are among the most fanatical believers in the imperial cult, willing to kill and die for a faith that was engineered into them from childhood. For the broader population, the ecclesiarchy offers a simpler but no less comprehensive form of indoctrination. Daily worship services, mandatory on many worlds, involve hours of prayer, hymn singing, and sermons that reinforce the core messages of obedience, sacrifice, and hatred of the other. Religious festivals, which are often the only forms of entertainment permitted on many worlds, serve as opportunities for mass displays of devotion that strengthen social bonds while simultaneously directing emotional energy toward the Imperium's approved outlets. Confession, a practice borrowed from ancient Terran religions, allows the ecclesiarchy to monitor the thoughts and feelings of the population, identifying potential dissenters before they can become active threats. The ecclesiarchy is not merely a spiritual institution, it is also a political one, and its history is marked by the same kind of power struggles, corruption, and violence that characterize every other imperial organization. The most dramatic example of the ecclesiarchy's potential for abuse came during the 36th millennium, in a period known as the Age of Apostasy. At the center of this catastrophe was a man named Gog Vandire, who managed to accumulate the titles of both Master of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch, making him the single most powerful individual in the Imperium since the Emperor himself. Vandire used this dual authority to launch a reign of terror that has been remembered for millennia as the Reign of Blood. During the Reign of Blood, Vandire wielded the combined power of the Imperium's civil government and its state religion as weapons of personal tyranny. He purged the ecclesiarchy of anyone who opposed him. He executed or assassinated countless officials, military officers, and religious leaders who questioned his authority. He raised massive armies of fanatical followers and used them to crush any world or organization that dared resist his rule. He even co-opted an entire order of warrior women, the daughters of the emperor, renaming them the brides of the emperor and transforming them into his personal bodyguard and instrument of terror. The Reign of Blood was eventually ended by a popular uprising led by a preacher named Sebastian Thor, who organized a movement called the Confederation of Light to oppose Vandire's tyranny. Thor, later recognized as one of the greatest saints in imperial history, led a crusade that eventually reached Terra itself, where Vandire was killed and the ecclesiarchy was reformed. But the reforms that Thor introduced, while significant, did not fundamentally change the nature of the ecclesiarchy or its relationship to the imperial population. The most important reform was the decree passive, which forbade the ecclesiarchy from maintaining armed forces of its own, men under arms, that is. This decree led to the creation of the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, as a technically separate military organization that served the ecclesiarchy's interests while remaining within the letter of the law. The decree passive was a clever piece of legislation, but it was a bandage on a wound that went far deeper than any decree could address. The fundamental problem with the ecclesiarchy was not that it had too many soldiers. The problem was that it had too much power over the hearts and minds of the imperial population. And that power, the power to define what is true, what is sacred, what is permissible, and what is heresy, remained intact after the decree passive, just as it had been before. In the millennia since the Age of Apostasy, the ecclesiarchy has continued to serve as one of the Imperium's primary instruments of social control. Wars of faith, massive military campaigns launched on religious pretexts, remain a regular occurrence. Entire worlds have been put to the torch because their interpretation of the imperial creed differed from the approved orthodoxy in ways so subtle that most people could not even understand the theological distinction being drawn. Confessors, those itinerant preachers who travel from world to world stirring up religious fervor, have started riots, purges, and planetary civil wars with their fiery rhetoric. Missionaries have imposed the imperial creed on cultures that had their own perfectly functional belief systems, destroying indigenous traditions and replacing them with the standardized devotion to the emperor that the ecclesiarchy demands. And throughout it all, yes, the ecclesiarchy has maintained its grip on the one thing that matters most, the narrative, the story that the imperial population tells itself about who they are, why they suffer, and what it all means. As long as the ecclesiarchy controls that narrative, as long as citizens believe that their suffering is sacred and their obedience is divine, the Imperium does not need to justify itself. It does not need to improve. It does not need to change. It simply needs to keep the faithful believing and the faithless burning. This is the power of religion weaponized, not faith in the sense of genuine spiritual seeking, not the personal relationship between a soul and whatever greater reality it believes in, but faith as a tool of control, as a mechanism for ensuring that the oppressed not only accept their oppression, but actively embrace it as a gift from their God. The emperor, if he could still communicate, might weep at what has been done in his name, or perhaps he would recognize the bitter irony that the very thing he fought hardest to prevent, the deification of a living being and the transformation of reason into superstition, is now the single strongest pillar supporting the civilization he built. Then again, he is trapped on the golden throne, fed a daily diet of sacrificed psychic souls, unable to speak or act or correct the terrible misunderstandings that have calcified into holy law over 10,000 years. And that, in itself, is perhaps the most damning indictment of the Imperium imaginable, as it has turned its founder into a prisoner and its greatest protector into its greatest victim, and it calls this arrangement holy. Part 4. The Thought Police. If the ecclesiarchy controls the soul of the Imperium, the Inquisition controls its fear. And in a civilization built on fear, that makes the Inquisition perhaps the most powerful institution in the galaxy. The Inquisition was founded in the dying hours of the Horus heresy, when the Emperor, preparing to confront his traitorous son Horus aboard the War Master's flagship, instructed his closest advisor, Malcador the Sigillite, to assemble a group of individuals who would serve as the Imperium's eternal watchmen. Their mandate was simple in principle and terrifying in practice: protect the Imperium from all threats, internal and external, by any means necessary. And no authority would stand above them. No organization would be immune to their scrutiny. No individual, no matter how powerful or well-connected, would be beyond their reach. For 10,000 years, the Inquisition has fulfilled that mandate with a zeal that would impress the most dedicated fanatic and a ruthlessness that would disturb the most hardened killer. Operating outside the established hierarchy of the Imperium, answering to no one except each other and the distant authority of the Emperor himself, individual inquisitors wield a degree of personal power that is almost inconceivable. An inquisitor can commandeer military forces, requisition ships, conscript civilians, arrest planetary governors, and order the execution of anyone they deem a threat to the Imperium, as they can declare entire worlds guilty of heresy and order their destruction. They can override the authority of Space Marine chapter masters, Imperial Navy admirals, and even other inquisitors. The theoretical purpose of this extraordinary authority is to give the Inquisition the flexibility it needs to respond to threats that the Imperium's normal institutions cannot handle. Chaos, corruption, alien infiltration, and heretical conspiracies do not respect bureaucratic jurisdictions or chains of command. They require agents who can act quickly, decisively, and without the delays imposed by normal governmental procedures. In practice, however, the Inquisition's unlimited authority has created a system in which individual inquisitors operate with effectively zero accountability. There is no civilian oversight of the Inquisition. There is no appeals process for those accused by it. There is no independent body that reviews its decisions or investigates its abuses. The only check on an inquisitor's power is the possibility that another inquisitor might disagree with their methods, and even this check is unreliable. since Inquisitors are as likely to war with each other as they are to cooperate. The result is an organization that, while genuinely dedicated to the protection of the Imperium, is also responsible for some of the most horrific abuses of power in Imperial history. Worlds have been destroyed because a single Inquisitor decided, based on evidence that may or may not have been accurate, that the planet was too corrupted to save. Populations have been massacred because an Inquisitor determined that the risk of chaos contamination spreading from a single infected individual was too great to contain through conventional means. Entire cultures have been erased because their practices, while not actually heretical, were sufficiently unusual to arouse suspicion in the mind of a passing Inquisitor who happened to have a particularly aggressive interpretation of their mandate. The Inquisition is divided into several major ordos, each dedicated to combating a specific category of threat. The Ordo Malleus hunts demons and fights the forces of chaos. The Ordo Xenos monitors and eliminates alien threats. The Ordo Hereticus roots out heresy, corruption, and treachery within the Imperium's own institutions. Each Ordo has its own specialized knowledge, its own networks of agents and informants, and its own military forces, the Grey Knights, the Death Watch, and the Adepta Sororitas, respectively. But regardless of which Ordo they belong to, all Inquisitors share a common philosophy that can be summarized in a single, chilling maxim. There are no innocents, only varying degrees of guilt. This philosophy pervades everything the Inquisition does. When an Inquisitor investigates a potential threat, they do not approach the situation with the presumption that the accused are innocent until proven guilty. They approach it with the assumption that guilt is universal, and the only question is how much guilt exists and what form the punishment should take. Entire populations can be subjected to mass interrogation, forced relocation, mind-wiping, or outright extermination based on the actions of a handful of individuals, or even on the mere suspicion that such actions might have occurred. The practice of mind-wiping deserves particular attention because it represents one of the Inquisition's more insidious tools of control. When Imperial citizens are exposed to knowledge that the Inquisition considers dangerous, which includes any knowledge of the true nature of chaos, the existence of demons, the details of the Horus heresy, or any number of other subjects that the average citizen is not permitted to know about, they are subjected to a process that erases the forbidden knowledge from their memories. The fact that this process also frequently erases large portions of the victim's other memories, their personality, their skills, their relationships, and everything that makes them who they are, is considered an acceptable cost. Those who survive the mind-wiping process intact enough to function are sometimes released back into the population, though they often find that they can no longer remember their families, their homes, or their own names. Those who are too damaged to function are typically disposed of, either through execution or through servitorization. And those who are deemed too dangerous to release, even after mind-wiping, are imprisoned indefinitely in facilities that are themselves classified as state secrets. But the Inquisition's most terrifying power, the one that hangs over every world in the Imperium like a perpetual storm cloud, is the power of Exterminatus, the authority to order the complete destruction of an entire planet's biosphere. Exterminatus is the Imperium's ultimate sanction, the final solution to a problem that cannot be solved by any other means. When an Inquisitor or a Space Marine, Chapter Master, or a Lord High Admiral determines that a world has been so thoroughly corrupted by chaos, so completely overrun by alien infestation, or so dangerously compromised by heresy that it cannot be salvaged, they can order the deployment of weapons that will destroy all life on the planet's surface. The weapons used for Exterminatus vary, but they are all horrifying. Cyclonic torpedoes deliver payloads that scour a planet's surface clean of life. Virus bombs release pathogens that dissolve all organic matter into a flammable sludge, which is then ignited by orbital bombardment, turning the entire atmosphere into a firestorm. Two-stage cyclonic torpedoes can bore through a planet's crust and destabilize its core, physically destroying the world from the inside out. The theoretical justification for exterminatus is that it is a last resort, used only when the alternative would be the spread of corruption or contamination to other worlds, potentially endangering billions or trillions of additional lives. And in some cases, that justification may genuinely hold. A world fully consumed by a genestealer cult that is about to summon a tyrannid hive fleet might genuinely need to be destroyed to prevent a far greater catastrophe. A planet that has been completely overrun by demonic forces might be beyond any possibility of conventional reclamation. But the history of the Imperium is littered with examples of exterminatus being used far more casually than the theoretical justification would suggest. Worlds have been destroyed over relatively minor chaos infestations that could have been contained through conventional military operations. Planets have been exterminated because the cost of reclaiming them militarily was deemed too high, even when the population was largely innocent. In some cases, exterminatus has been ordered by inquisitors whose judgment was questionable, whose intelligence was incomplete, or whose personal motivations were less than pure. The oversight that exists over exterminatus orders is minimal at best. While an inquisitor who orders an exterminatus without sufficient justification may face scrutiny from their peers after the fact, this scrutiny comes too late for the billions of people who have already been killed. And even when scrutiny is applied, the bar for justification is extraordinarily low. The Imperium's fundamental assumption that any taint of chaos is sufficient grounds for total destruction makes it nearly impossible to argue that a given exterminatus was unjustified, since the evidence of the threat was destroyed along with the planet. The mere existence of exterminatus as a policy has profound effects on the Imperium's population, even on worlds that have never been targeted. Every Imperial citizen lives with the knowledge, however dimly understood, that their entire world can be destroyed at the stroke of a pen. Then this knowledge creates a culture of conformity that goes far beyond what any amount of propaganda or religious indoctrination could achieve alone. When the punishment for deviation is not merely personal execution, but the annihilation of everyone you have ever known or loved, the incentive to conform is absolute. And this is precisely the point. The Inquisition does not merely punish threats, it creates an atmosphere of terror that prevents threats from emerging in the first place. The population of the Imperium is not merely obedient, it is paralyzed, trapped between the genuine external threats that require the Imperium's protection and the internal threat that the Imperium itself represents. To step out of line is to invite destruction not just upon yourself, but upon everyone around you. The Inquisition, was for all its stated devotion to the Emperor's cause, operates in a way that would be utterly alien to any notion of justice, fairness, or basic human rights. It is judge, jury, and executioner, answering to no authority, constrained by no law, and guided by a philosophy that treats the very people it is supposed to protect as potential enemies. In any other context, we would call such an organization a secret police, a terror apparatus, the enforcing arm of a totalitarian state. In the Imperium of Man, it is called necessary, and that, perhaps, is the most frightening thing of all. Part 5. The War Machine. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. That phrase, which has become the defining motto of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, is more than just a tagline. It is a literal description of the Imperium's operating principle. The Imperium of Man is a civilization permanently mobilized for war, and the consequences of that permanent mobilization are felt most keenly by the billions upon billions of ordinary human beings who are fed into the war machine's insatiable appetite. The Astra Militarum, commonly known as the Imperial Guard, is the largest military force in the galaxy. Its exact size is unknown, even to the Departamento Munitorum that supposedly manages it, but it is believed to number in the trillions. Every single year, trillions of new recruits are tithed from worlds across the Imperium, adding their bodies to a war machine that consumes human lives the way a furnace consumes fuel. The average guardsman is not a genetically enhanced superhuman in power armor. Yeah, they are an ordinary human being, a farmer from an agri-world, a factory worker from a hive city, a tribal warrior from a feral planet, pressed into service through the imperial tithe. They are given a laser gun, a weapon that, while capable of blowing off a limb, is among the weakest in the setting. They are given flak armor, a protective garment that most other factions' standard weapons can punch through without effort. They are given a brief training regimen that focuses more on propaganda and indoctrination than actual combat skills. And they are shipped off to fight enemies that include 7-foot-tall Chaos Space Marines in blessed power armor, orc warbands that can number in the hundreds of millions, tyrannid bioforms specifically designed to kill, and horrors from the warp that can drive a person insane simply by being perceived. Whilst the tactical doctrines of the Imperial Guard reflect the Imperium's fundamental view of its citizens, they are expendable. While the law is careful to note that a competent commander does not throw away lives needlessly, the definition of needlessly in the Imperial context is dramatically different from what most people would consider reasonable. Attacks that are expected to sustain 90% casualties can be considered acceptable if the objective is deemed sufficiently important. Entire regiments can be sacrificed as diversions to cover the movements of other, more valuable forces. Populations can be drafted and sent into battle with minimal training, serving essentially as human shields for better-equipped units behind them. The institution of the Commissar perfectly encapsulates the Imperium's relationship with its soldiers, as commissars are officers of the Officio Prefectus, specifically trained and assigned to enforce discipline and loyalty within Imperial Guard units. They are not part of the unit's normal command structure. They are outsiders, political officers, whose primary function is to ensure that soldiers fight when ordered to fight, advance when ordered to advance, and die when ordered to die. Commissars are empowered to summarily execute any soldier who displays cowardice, insubordination, or any other behavior deemed detrimental to the unit's combat effectiveness. This execution is typically performed publicly, with the Commissar's bolt pistol serving as both punishment and deterrent. The message is clear: retreat is not an option, refusal is not an option. The only direction is forward, toward the enemy, regardless of the odds, or regardless of the cost, regardless of whether the battle plan makes any strategic sense at all. There are commissars who are beloved by their troops, who lead from the front and earn respect through personal bravery and tactical competence. The famous Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt of the Tanith First and Only is perhaps the best-known example. But the institution itself is designed around the principle that soldiers cannot be trusted to do their duty willingly, that they must be coerced through the threat of immediate, violent death. This is not a military organization that believes in its people. This is a military organization that fears its people and controls them through terror. The Astra Militarum's method of organizing its forces is itself a form of control. Regiments are raised from single worlds and then shipped to fight on other worlds, far from their homes. They are never permitted to return to their world of origin. This practice serves a dual purpose. It prevents regiments from developing the kind of local loyalty that might lead them to defend their homeworld against the Imperium itself, and it ensures that soldiers are always fighting in unfamiliar terrain, among unfamiliar cultures, with no connections to the local population that might complicate their willingness to carry out imperial orders. This last point is particularly important when you consider the kinds of orders that Imperial Guard units are sometimes required to carry out. The Astra Militarum is not used solely against alien threats. It is regularly deployed against human populations that have been deemed rebellious, heretical, or otherwise unacceptable to imperial authority. When a world's population rises up against a tyrannical governor, it is the Imperial Guard that puts down the rebellion. When a chaos cult infiltrates a hive city, it is the Imperial Guard that is sent in to purge the infected areas, along with everyone who happens to live in them. When the Inquisition determines that a population must be quarantined, relocated, or eliminated, it is the Imperial Guard that carries out the order. By shipping regiments far from their homes and deliberately severing their connections to any particular world or population, the Imperium ensures that the soldiers carrying out these orders have no personal stake in the outcome. They are killing strangers in a strange place. On the orders of authorities, they have been trained since childhood to obey without question. The emotional and psychological barriers that might prevent a person from participating in atrocities against people they know and care about are systematically removed. The death cores of Krieg are perhaps the most extreme example of what the Imperium's war machine does to the human beings caught within it. Krieg was a world that rebelled against Imperial rule and fought a 500-year civil war that included nuclear self-annihilation of its own surface. The Loyalist faction eventually won, but the victory came at the cost of rendering the planet nearly uninhabitable. As penance for the original rebellion, the Administratum imposed a colossal tithe of soldiers on Krieg, demanding over 50 million soldiers per year from a devastated, radiation-scarred world. The result is a culture built entirely around the production of soldiers for the Imperial Guard. Krieg's population exists to breed, train, and ship off the next generation of fighters. The Death Corps regiments they produce are renowned for their grim determination and their willingness to fight in the most horrific conditions imaginable, employing siege warfare tactics that involve sustained attrition, gas attacks, and human wave assaults, with a callousness that shocks even other Imperial Guard units. But the Death Corps are not admirable. They are a tragedy. They are what happens when the Imperium's punishment for rebellion is applied to an entire planet for over 1,000 years, when the guilt of an ancestor's choice is visited upon generation after generation after generation, until the very concept of a life worth living has been completely erased from a culture's collective memory. The Death Corps do not fight because they believe in the Emperor's cause. They fight because they believe they deserve to die, and the best they can hope for is a death that serves some purpose. The Imperium holds the Death Corps up as an example of dedication and loyalty. But what it actually is, what it actually represents, is a monument to the Imperium's capacity to destroy the human spirit so thoroughly that its victims become willing participants in their own destruction. And the Death Corps are not unique. They are an extreme example of a pattern that repeats itself across the Astra Militarum, across the entire Imperium. Cultures shaped by punishment, populations conditioned to view their own lives as worthless, yet human beings raised from birth to believe that their only value lies in their willingness to die on command. The Space Marines, for all the glorification they receive in Imperial propaganda and in the game's marketing, represent another facet of the same problem. The process of creating a Space Marine begins with the recruitment of young boys, typically between the ages of 10 and 14, from planets across the Imperium. These children are subjected to a brutal selection process in which the majority of aspirants die before they even begin their genetic modification. Those who survive undergo years of agonizing surgery, implantation, and psychological conditioning that transforms them from human children into something else entirely, something that is more powerful than a human being but arguably less human. Space Marines do not have families, they do not have homes, they do not have personal relationships, hobbies, interests, or any of the things that give meaning to a normal human life. They have war. That is all they have. They are weapons that happen to be capable of thought, and the thoughts they are permitted to think are carefully curated by the chapter's chaplains and librarians to ensure that they remain focused on their singular purpose. The Imperium takes children and turns them into living weapons. It erases their humanity, their potential, their futures, and it replaces all of it with the ability and the willingness to kill. And it calls this process an honor. But the real cost of the Imperium's war machine is not measured in the Space Marines who have been transformed or the Guardsmen who have been sacrificed. It is measured in the civilizations that have been destroyed to sustain it. Every soldier in the Astra Militarum was, before they were conscripted, someone: a farmer, a craftsperson, a parent, a child. Every one of those trillions of guardsmen represents a life that was interrupted, a family that was broken, a community that lost a member it could not replace. And the Imperium's wars do not end. They cannot end. The Imperium is structured so that war is not a temporary crisis, but a permanent condition, a state of affairs that justifies the continued existence of the institutions that wage it and the continued oppression of the populations that fund it. If the wars ever ended, if peace ever came to the galaxy, the entire justification for the Imperium's existence would collapse. The ecclesiarchy would have no heretics to burn. The Inquisition would have no conspiracies to uncover. The Astra Militarum would have no enemies to fight. The system would implode. Whether consciously or not, the Imperium has constructed a civilization that needs war in order to survive, that requires a constant supply of enemies in order to maintain its grip on power. And if the enemies are not immediately available, the Imperium is perfectly capable of creating them, by pushing populations to rebellion through oppression, by provoking alien civilizations through aggression, or by simply redefining the criteria for what constitutes a threat, until everyone who is not perfectly, absolutely, unconditionally loyal is classified as an enemy of mankind. The war machine grinds on, consuming lives and worlds with equal indifference, and the Imperium calls it duty. But from where the bodies fall, it looks a great deal more like hunger. Part 6. The Cult of Ignorance. Of all the Imperium's many sins, its deliberate cultivation of ignorance may be the most destructive in the long term. While the ecclesiarchy suppresses spiritual freedom and the Inquisition suppresses political freedom, the Adeptus Mechanicus suppresses something even more fundamental: the freedom to learn, to discover, to understand the universe, and to build something new. The Adeptus Mechanicus, commonly known as the Cult Mechanicus, or simply the Mechanicus, is the Imperium's scientific and technological priesthood. They are responsible for the construction and maintenance of virtually all advanced technology in the Imperium. They are from the lasguns, carried by common guardsmen, to the mighty warships of the Imperial Navy, to the Golden Throne itself. Without the Mechanicus, the Imperium would collapse within a generation, its ships unable to fly, its weapons unable to fire, its factories unable to produce. This gives the Mechanicus enormous power, and they wield it jealously. But the truly damaging aspect of the Mechanicus is not their political influence. It is their approach to technology itself, an approach that has effectively frozen human technological development in place for 10,000 years, and in many areas, allowed it to actively regress. The Mechanicus does not view technology as a tool to be understood, improved, and adapted to changing circumstances. They view it as a sacred mystery, a gift from a divine being they call the Omnissiah, who they believe is either identical to or closely associated with the Emperor of mankind. Machines are not constructed. They are given form through sacred rituals. Maintenance is not a technical process. It is a religious observance. The activation of an engine requires the application of ritual oils, the burning of sacred resins, and the chanting of lengthy hymns. If a machine breaks down, the Mechanicus does not troubleshoot the problem. They pray to the machine's spirit and attempt to appease it. This approach stems from a legitimate historical trauma. During the dark age of technology, humanity created artificial intelligences of staggering sophistication, the so-called Men of Iron, who eventually turned on their creators in a catastrophic uprising known as the Cybernetic Revolt. The devastation wrought by this revolt, combined with the horrors of the age of strife that followed, created a deep, species-wide fear of uncontrolled technological innovation. The Mechanicus emerged from this trauma as a kind of technological priesthood, devoted to preserving the knowledge that remained, while ensuring that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. But what began as a reasonable caution has calcified, over 10,000 years, into a pathological aversion to any form of innovation or progress. The Mechanicus does not merely restrict the development of artificial intelligence, which might be defensible given the historical context. They restrict all innovation. They restrict the understanding of existing technology. They restrict the asking of questions, the testing of hypotheses, the exploration of new ideas. Any deviation from established designs and procedures or doctrines is labeled tech heresy and punished with the same ferocity that the Inquisition brings to spiritual heresy. The consequences of this approach are visible everywhere in the Imperium. Weapons and vehicles that were common during the Great Crusade, 10,000 years ago, are now irreplaceable relics because the knowledge of how to manufacture them has been lost. Warships are maintained by tech priests who can perform the rituals of maintenance but do not understand the underlying principles that make the ships function. Forge worlds, the massive industrial planets that produce the Imperium's most advanced technology, spend as much time searching for fragments of ancient designs as they do actually manufacturing anything. The Standard Template Construct, or STC, or system was originally created during the Dark Age of technology as a way to provide colony worlds with the knowledge they needed to build and maintain advanced technology. Complete STC databases contain the designs for virtually everything a human settlement could need, from basic agricultural equipment to advanced spacecraft. But the STC databases were lost or corrupted during the Age of Strife, and the Mechanicus has been searching for fragments of them ever since. The discovery of even a single STC printout for a new design is considered one of the most significant events possible in Mechanicus culture. Wars have been fought over STC fragments. Entire expeditions have been launched into the most dangerous regions of the galaxy to recover them. The Mechanicus treats STC designs with a reverence that most religions reserve for their most sacred scriptures, because in a very real sense, they are. They are the only source of new technology that the Mechanicus considers legitimate, because they come from the blessed era of humanity's technological peak before the fall. This obsession with the past has created a civilization that is, in many ways, going backward. Technologies that were routine in the 30th millennium are now rare or unknown in the 41st. Plasma weapons, which were once standard equipment for many military forces, are now dangerously unstable and prone to catastrophic malfunction because the knowledge of how to properly manufacture them has degraded over the centuries. Volkite weaponry, a powerful energy weapon that was common during the Great Crusade, has gone almost completely extinct because the manufacturing processes are simply no longer understood. The human cost of this technological stagnation is immense. Diseases that could be cured go untreated because the medical knowledge has been lost or restricted. Agricultural techniques that could feed billions go unused because they are not part of the approved STC designs. Industrial processes that could dramatically improve the quality of life for imperial citizens are suppressed because they represent unauthorized deviations from sacred templates. And the Mechanicus does not merely fail to innovate, it actively punishes those who try. Tech priests who experiment with new designs or attempt to understand the principles behind existing technologies are branded as heretics, are outcasts who are hunted by both the Mechanicus and the Inquisition. The penalty for tech heresy ranges from exile to execution to servitorization, depending on the severity of the offense and the inclinations of the local authorities. This creates a vicious cycle of decline. As knowledge is lost, the ability to maintain existing technology deteriorates. As maintenance deteriorates, the demand for replacement parts and new equipment increases. But the Mechanicus cannot meet this demand because they cannot innovate, and the STC fragments they discover are too few and too incomplete to keep pace with the rate of loss. The Imperium is slowly, inexorably, losing its technological capabilities, one forgotten manufacturing process at a time. Meanwhile, the Imperium's enemies are not standing still. The Tau Empire, a relatively young and small civilization compared to the Imperium, has achieved technological advances in a few thousand years that the Imperium has been unable to match in 10,000. Their pulse weapons, their battle suits, their starships, all represent innovations that the Tau developed through the simple process of experimentation, testing, and iterative improvement, the basic scientific method that the Mechanicus has declared heretical. The Necrons possess technology so advanced that it makes even the lost wonders of the Dark Age of technology look primitive. The Eldar, despite their declining population, maintain technologies that the Imperium cannot replicate or even understand. Even the Orcs, whose technology looks crude and improvised, then have a biological relationship with their machines that allows them to innovate and adapt with a speed that the Mechanicus cannot match. The Imperium is falling behind. It has been falling behind for centuries, and the Mechanicus, the very institution charged with maintaining humanity's technological edge, is the primary reason why. By turning science into religion and curiosity into heresy, the Mechanicus has ensured that the Imperium will never develop the new technologies it needs to meet new threats. It has condemned humanity to fight an endless war with weapons that are growing older, less reliable, and less effective with every passing century. The defense that is always offered for the Mechanicus is that their caution is justified by the horrors of the cybernetic revolt, that the dangers of uncontrolled innovation are too great to risk, that the restrictions they impose are necessary to prevent a repeat of the catastrophe that nearly destroyed humanity once before. And there is something to this argument. The dangers of artificial intelligence in the Warhammer 40,000 universe are real. The Men of Iron were a genuine threat, and the trauma they inflicted was catastrophic. But the Mechanicus does not just prohibit artificial intelligence, it prohibits everything. It does not just restrict dangerous technologies, it restricts all technologies, including technologies that are manifestly safe and manifestly beneficial. The cure for a disease is not dangerous. An improved agricultural technique is not dangerous. A better way to insulate a habitation block against the cold is not dangerous. But all of these things, if they represent deviations from the approved templates, are heretical in the eyes of the Mechanicus. The result is a civilization that is slowly dying of its own ignorance, surrounded by enemies who are getting stronger while it gets weaker, clinging to the relics of a past it can barely understand, and punishing anyone who dares suggest that there might be a better way. This is not protection. This is suicide by orthodoxy. And the people who pay the price for it are not the tech priests in their forges on Mars, surrounded by their sacred machines and their ancient rituals. The people who pay the price are the billions of ordinary citizens who die of treatable diseases, who starve on worlds that could be fertile, who freeze in habitation blocks that could be warm, because the Adeptus Mechanicus has decided that knowledge itself is a sin. Part 7. The Paper Prison. There is a particular kind of horror that does not involve violence, that does not require weapons or armies or inquisitorial purges, but that is every bit as destructive as any of those things. It is the horror of bureaucracy, of systems so vast and so complex that they develop a life of their own, grinding forward with an inexorable momentum that crushes everything in their path, not out of malice, but out of sheer, mindless inertia. The Adeptus Administratum is the largest division of the Adeptus Terra, the Imperium's central government. It consists of untold billions of clerks, scribes, and administrative officials, whose job it is to manage the day-to-day operations of a galaxy-spanning empire. They assess tithes, they conduct censuses, they record and archive information, they allocate resources, they plan military campaigns, they catalogue planets, they do the 1,000,001 things that are necessary for the functioning of any government, let alone a government that spans 1,000,000 worlds. In theory, the Administratum is the oil that keeps the Imperium's machinery running. In practice, it is a tar pit that swallows entire planets. The Administratum is so large, so Byzantine in its complexity, that entire departments have been lost within its own structure. Forgotten offices staffed by forgotten officials carry out forgotten tasks for forgotten purposes, their work contributing nothing to the Imperium except the consumption of resources that might otherwise be put to productive use. Reports are filed that will never be read. Assessments are conducted that will never be acted upon. Requests pass through so many layers of approval that by the time they are granted, the original need has long since become irrelevant. The administratum's primary method of record-keeping and communication is parchment. In a civilization that spans the galaxy and possesses cogitators capable of processing vast amounts of data, the administratum conducts the majority of its business on handwritten documents made from animal hide. Legions of scribes work tirelessly producing records that, in many cases, duplicate the work being done by other scribes in other departments who are unaware of each other's existence. Vellum, the parchment upon which these records are written, is one of the largest imports to Terra by sheer weight. At a staggering allocation of resources dedicated to a medium that is less efficient, less durable, and less searchable than the alternatives. The consequences of the administratum's inefficiency are not merely comic, they are lethal. Tithe requests have been lost for centuries, arriving on worlds that have long since been destroyed or abandoned. Military reinforcements have been dispatched to battlefields where the fighting ended decades before. Worlds have been administratively lost, their records misfiled or destroyed, their populations forgotten by the government that claims sovereignty over them, left to fend for themselves against whatever threats emerge. The Departamento Munitorum, the branch of the administratum responsible for the logistics of the Astra Militarum, is perhaps the most consequential of the administratum's many divisions, and its failures are measured in lives rather than paperwork. The Munitorum is responsible for raising regiments, training troops, providing equipment and supplies, and transporting forces to and from theatres of war. It is also responsible for some of the most catastrophic logistical failures in Imperial history. Regiments have been shipped to war zones without adequate weapons or supplies because the Munitorum's paperwork was incomplete. Soldiers have arrived at their deployment locations to find that the war they were sent to fight ended years before, or that the planet they were supposed to defend no longer exists. Equipment requisitions have been filled incorrectly, sending winter gear to desert worlds and tropical uniforms to ice planets. Their food supplies have been routed to empty space stations while garrisoning forces starved. These are not isolated incidents. They are systemic failures that occur regularly throughout the Imperium, and they are a direct consequence of the administratum's size, its complexity, and its fundamental inability to manage the scale of operations that the Imperium demands of it. The human cost of these failures is immeasurable. How many soldiers have died because their reinforcements arrived too late? How many worlds have fallen to invasion because their pleas for help were lost in the administratum's filing system? How many populations have starved because the food that was supposed to feed them was shipped to the wrong sector? The answers to these questions are unknowable, down because the administratum's own records are too unreliable to provide them, and yet the administratum persists, not because it is effective, but because it is entrenched. It has been part of the Imperium structure for so long that removing it would be like trying to remove the skeleton from a living body. Every other institution depends on the administratum for resources, information, and logistical support. The Astra Militarum cannot fight without the Munitorum. The ecclesiarchy cannot maintain its network of churches and schools without administratum funding. The Inquisition, for all its independence, relies on administratum intelligence reports for much of its operational planning. The administratum is the Imperium in miniature, a system that is too large to function efficiently, too entrenched to reform, and too necessary to abandon. It perpetuates itself, not through any conscious plan or deliberate malice, but through the simple momentum of 10,000 years of accumulated procedure, regulation, and institutional inertia. And within this system, the people who actually do the work, the scribes and clerks and functionaries who spend their lives processing documents in gargantuan vaults, are themselves victims of the machine they serve. Their positions are often hereditary, passed from parent to child, without choice or opportunity for change. Their lives are monastic in their restriction, their entertainment limited to what the ecclesiarchy approves, their social interactions confined to colleagues in similar positions. They work 12-hour shifts in dimly lit chambers, surrounded by towers of parchment, processing information that in many cases will never be seen by anyone with the authority to act upon it. They are, in a very real sense, servitors of a different kind. Not lobotomized and wired into machinery, but ground down by routine and stripped of agency just as thoroughly. Their humanity consumed by a system that views them as nothing more than components in a vast, inefficient machine. The administratum does not intend to cause suffering. It is not staffed by villains who take pleasure in the misery they create. It is staffed by ordinary human beings who are doing their best within a system that was broken long before they were born and will remain broken long after they are dead. But the suffering happens regardless, because the system's inefficiency is not a bug, it is a feature. A government that functions too efficiently might become too powerful. A bureaucracy that actually works might enable the concentration of authority in ways that could threaten the delicate balance of power that keeps the Imperium from tearing itself apart. The administratum's dysfunction is, paradoxically, a form of stability. By ensuring that no single institution can operate at peak efficiency, by burying every decision under layers of approval and verification, the Imperium prevents any one organization from accumulating enough power to overthrow the others. The cost of this stability is measured in billions of lives lost to preventable failures. But the Imperium has never been particularly concerned about the cost of stability, so long as the cost is paid by the people at the bottom. This is governance by entropy. And this is a civilization that has decided that the slow decay of bureaucratic stagnation is preferable to the risks of reform, that the certain death of millions through administrative incompetence is a better outcome than the uncertain consequences of trying to do things differently. And for 10,000 years, this calculation has held. The Imperium endures, in spite of everything, held together by inertia, by faith, and by the simple fact that all the alternatives seem worse. But one has to wonder, at what point does the cost of endurance exceed the cost of change? At what point does the suffering inflicted by the system's preservation become greater than the suffering that its collapse would cause? At what point does the Imperium endures stop being a statement of triumph and start being a confession of failure? Well, if the administratum has no answer to these questions, it is not designed to answer questions. It is designed to process forms. Part 8. The Feeding of the Golden Throne. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, in a chamber so vast and so heavily shielded that it exists in a category of its own, there is a machine. It is a machine of such profound importance that the entire Imperium revolves around it, and of such profound horror that the full truth of its function is kept from all but the most senior members of the imperial hierarchy. The Golden Throne is the device that keeps the Emperor of mankind alive, if the word alive can be meaningfully applied to a being whose body has been a desiccated husk for 10,000 years, sustained only by the most advanced life support technology ever created and the sheer, a superhuman force of his psychic will. From the Golden Throne, the Emperor maintains the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows Imperial starships to navigate the warp, and that effectively defines the boundaries of the Imperium. Without the Astronomicon, interstellar travel would become nearly impossible. Interstellar communication would cease, and the Imperium would fragment into 1,000,000 isolated worlds, each one left to face the horrors of the galaxy alone. The Emperor's continued existence on the Golden Throne is therefore quite literally the single most important thing in the Imperium. Everything else, every institution, every army, every policy, every world, is ultimately subordinate to the necessity of keeping the Emperor alive and the Astronomicon functioning. And the price of that necessity is paid in the most terrible currency imaginable. The Golden Throne requires psychic energy to function, Specifically, it requires the life energy of human psykers, individuals born with the ability to touch the warp, to power both the Emperor's life support and the Astronomicon. Originally, the number of psykers required was approximately 1,000 per day. Over the millennia, as the Golden Throne has deteriorated and the demands upon the Astronomicon have increased, that number has grown. Some sources suggest that the current requirement is 4 times the original figure. 4,000 human beings, every day, sacrificed to keep the Emperor alive and the Imperium functioning. The process by which these psykers are acquired is itself a massive logistical operation. But the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica travel constantly throughout the Imperium, collecting psykers from every world they visit. Every planet in the Imperium is required to contribute its quota of psykers as part of the Imperial tithe, just as it contributes soldiers, resources, and raw materials. Being identified as a psyker in the Imperium is one of the worst fates that can befall a human being. The Imperial population is taught from birth that psykers are dangerous, cursed, tainted by their connection to the warp. When a child manifests psychic abilities, they are typically turned in by their own families, neighbors, or local authorities, often with a combination of fear and relief. Those who are not turned in are hunted by agents of the Inquisition and the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, tracked down and captured, sometimes with significant collateral damage to the communities that sheltered them. Once collected by the black ships, the psykers are transported to Terra in conditions that can only be described as nightmarish. The ships themselves are heavily shielded against psychic phenomena, necessary given the concentration of psykers within their hulls. But the journey is long, dangerous, and often fatal. Many psykers do not survive the journey. Those who do arrive on Terra broken in mind and body, reduced to little more than vessels of psychic energy waiting to be consumed. Upon arrival on Terra, the psykers are sorted. A small number, those whose powers are strong enough to be useful but controllable enough to be safe, are selected for training as sanctioned psykers or astropaths, the psychic communicators that enable interstellar messaging across the Imperium. These fortunate few are subjected to the process of soul binding, a ritual in which a fraction of the Emperor's own psychic power is used to shield them against demonic possession, at the cost of burning out their eyes and leaving them permanently scarred. But the vast majority of psykers collected by the black ships are not so fortunate. They are fated for the Golden Throne, their psychic energy consumed to sustain the Emperor and power the Astronomicon. The exact mechanism by which this sacrifice is carried out is one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets. What is known is that the psykers are placed in special chambers around the throne, where their life force is gradually drained, their psychic energy absorbed by the ancient machinery and channeled to the Emperor. They die in agony, their consciousness consumed along with their energy, screaming into a void that no one hears and no one acknowledges. Let us sit with that for a moment. 1,000 to 4,000 human beings murdered every day, their souls consumed by a machine and the being that sits within it. Not in battle, not in defense of their homes or their families, but strapped into a machine and drained of their life force, in a process that the Imperium considers too sacred and too necessary to question. This has been happening for 10,000 years. The mathematics are staggering. At the original rate of 1,000 per day, the Golden Throne has consumed approximately 3.65 billion psykers since the Emperor was first interred. At the current rate, well, the number could be 4 times that. Somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 15 billion human beings have been sacrificed to keep the Emperor alive and the Astronomicon burning. And the demand is growing. The Golden Throne is deteriorating. The Mechanicus tech priests who maintain it report with increasing alarm that the device is failing, its ancient systems breaking down one by one, requiring ever more psychic energy to compensate for the declining efficiency of its machinery. The black ships increase in number and frequency, their voyages becoming more desperate, their quotas more demanding. Worlds that once contributed a handful of psychers per generation are now being stripped bare, their psyker populations harvested so aggressively that the psychic gene is being bred out of entire planetary populations. Whilst the Imperium justifies this ongoing sacrifice by pointing to the alternative. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium falls. Without the Emperor on the throne, the psychic wards that protect Terra from demonic invasion would collapse, and the homeworld of humanity would be consumed by the forces of chaos. The sacrifice of billions to save trillions is, by the cold calculus of imperial governance, an acceptable trade. But this justification raises uncomfortable questions. The Emperor himself built the Golden Throne as a temporary measure, a stopgap, while he worked on a far more ambitious project. The creation of a human-accessible webway that would allow interstellar travel without the need for the warp at all. That project was destroyed during the Horus Heresy when Magnus the Red. The Imperium has made no serious attempt. The Imperium has made no serious attempt to find an alternative to the Golden Throne. No research into new methods of interstellar navigation. No exploration of the webway that the Eldar still use. No investigation of any technology or technique that might reduce or eliminate the need for the daily sacrifice of psychic souls. The Imperium has simply accepted the sacrifice as permanent and built its entire civilization around the assumption that it will continue forever. This is not the behavior of a civilization that values human life. This is the behavior of a civilization that has become addicted to a particular method of operation and cannot imagine any other way of functioning. The sacrifice has become sacred, the suffering has become ritual, and the very idea of seeking an alternative has become, like so many other ideas in the Imperium, heretical. And there is one final, deeply disturbing element to the story of the Golden Throne that is worth considering. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that the throne powers, does more than enable Imperial navigation. It also serves as a beacon for the Tyranids, the vast hive fleets that are converging on the galaxy from the intergalactic void are being drawn, at least in part, by the psychic light of the Astronomicon. Yet the very thing that keeps the Imperium functioning is also guiding one of its most dangerous enemies directly toward it. The Imperium is, in effect, ringing a dinner bell across the cosmos, broadcasting its location to a species that wants to devour every last trace of organic matter in the galaxy, and it is paying for this broadcast with the lives of thousands of its own citizens every day. The sacrifice that sustains the Imperium is also drawing the force that may ultimately destroy it. If that is not a perfect metaphor for the Imperium of man, I do not know what is. A civilization that feeds on its own people to sustain a beacon that guides its own destruction, and calls the entire arrangement the will of God. Part 9. The self-fulfilling prophecy. We have spent a considerable amount of time examining the individual components of the Imperium's machinery of oppression, its religious control, its secret police, its war machine, its technological stagnation, its bureaucratic paralysis, its ritualized sacrifice. But now it is time to look at the big picture, to examine how all of these elements interact and reinforce each other, creating a system that is not merely oppressive, but actively self-destructive. The central paradox of the Imperium of man is that it creates the very threats it claims to exist, to fight. This is not a minor detail or an incidental side effect of imperial policy. It is the fundamental dynamic that drives the setting, the engine that keeps the grimdark universe spinning. And it is the strongest evidence that the Imperium is not merely flawed, but is, in a very real sense, the galaxy's greatest villain. Let us begin with chaos, which is arguably the Imperium's most dangerous and persistent enemy. The Chaos Gods, those vast entities of the warp, known as Khorne, Nurgle, Tzientch, and Slaanesh, are sustained by the emotions of sentient beings. They feed on rage, on despair, on ambition, on excess. The more negative emotion that exists in the galaxy, the stronger they become. The more suffering there is, the more power they accumulate. The more hopeless and desperate sentient beings feel, the more fuel the Chaos Gods have to work with. Now consider the Imperium, a civilization of untold quadrillions of human beings, the vast majority of whom live in conditions of grinding poverty, constant fear, enforced ignorance, and relentless oppression. A civilization where every day is a struggle for survival, where hope is systematically crushed, where the only emotions that the system encourages are rage against the alien and obedience to authority. A civilization where the penalty for even the smallest deviation from approved behavior is death or worse. The Imperium is, by any reasonable measure, one of the largest generators of negative emotional energy in the galaxy. The suffering of its citizens does not simply exist in a vacuum. It flows into the warp, feeding the Chaos Gods, making them stronger, giving them more power to corrupt and destroy. Every hive world where workers toil in misery produces a psychic echo in the warp that empowers the very entities the Imperium is fighting against. Every purge by the Inquisition, every execution by a commissar, every prayer uttered in desperation by a citizen who knows that the Emperor cannot hear them, all of it feeds chaos. This creates a vicious cycle that is almost impossible to break. The Imperium's oppression feeds chaos. Chaos grows stronger and threatens the Imperium. The Imperium responds to the increased threat by becoming more oppressive. The increased oppression feeds more energy to chaos. And so the cycle continues, each iteration ratcheting the misery and the danger a little higher. The Imperium is not just fighting chaos, it is feeding chaos, and it cannot stop feeding chaos without fundamentally changing the nature of its own governance, which is something it is constitutionally incapable of doing. The very institutions that make the Imperium what it is, the ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, the administratum, are so deeply invested in the current system that any attempt at reform would be treated as heresy and crushed. And chaos is not the only enemy that the Imperium helps create. Consider the Imperium's relationship with the alien species of the galaxy. The imperial doctrine of universal xenophobia, inherited from the Great Crusade and intensified by 10,000 years of religious indoctrination, ensures that the Imperium treats every alien civilization as an enemy by default. There is no provision in imperial law or theology for peaceful coexistence with alien species. There is no mechanism for diplomacy, for trade, for cultural exchange, or for any of the other interactions that might reduce the likelihood of conflict. The result is that the Imperium is at war with essentially every alien species it encounters, including many that might otherwise be willing to live in peace. The Tau Empire, for example, has repeatedly attempted to establish diplomatic relations with the Imperium and has been rebuffed every time. The Craftworld Eldar, despite their own considerable xenophobia, have on numerous occasions attempted to warn the Imperium of shared threats or propose temporary alliances against common enemies, only to be treated with suspicion and hostility. Even within the Imperium's own ranks, the policy of universal xenophobia has created problems. Human worlds that had established peaceful relationships with alien species during the Age of Strife were forced to abandon those relationships when the Great Crusade arrived. The knowledge and technology that might have been gained through those relationships was lost, but the goodwill that might have been built was destroyed. And in many cases, the alien species that had been living peacefully alongside human populations were driven to hostility by the Imperium's aggression, creating enemies where none had existed before. The Imperium's relationship with its own citizens follows a similar pattern of self-fulfilling prophecy. The Imperium fears rebellion, so it oppresses its population. Oppression breeds resentment, which breeds rebellion. The Imperium responds to rebellion with more oppression, which breeds more resentment, which breeds more rebellion. Worlds that might have remained loyal if treated with basic fairness are driven to revolt by the weight of imperial taxation, the brutality of imperial governance, and the suffocating restrictions of imperial culture. And when those worlds revolt, But the Imperium does not ask why. It does not examine the conditions that led to the rebellion, or consider whether its own policies might have been a contributing factor. It simply sends in the Imperial Guard to crush the revolt, purges the survivors, and imposes even harsher conditions on the population that remains. The lesson that the Imperium draws from every rebellion is not we should treat our people better, but we should control them more tightly. This dynamic extends to the Imperium's relationship with chaos as well. The vast majority of individuals who fall to chaos worship do not do so because they are inherently evil or because they are attracted to the aesthetic of skulls and tentacles. They fall because they are desperate. As they fall because the system that is supposed to protect them has failed them so completely that the promises of chaos, power, freedom, relief from suffering seem like the only alternative to a life of unending misery. The cult of Nurgle, for example, thrives in the poorest and most plague-ridden areas of the Imperium, where inadequate medical care and unsanitary living conditions make disease a constant companion. Nurgle offers his followers an end to pain, an embrace of decay that transforms suffering into something almost tolerable. The cult of Tzientch appeals to those who feel trapped by the Imperium's rigid hierarchy, offering the hope of change and advancement to people who have been told from birth that their place in the social order is fixed and immutable. Oh, the cult of Slaanesh finds converts among those whose lives are so devoid of pleasure and meaning that any sensation, no matter how extreme, seems preferable to the numbness of their daily existence. Even Horn, the blood god, whose worship is the most straightforwardly violent, finds fertile ground in the Imperium. In a civilization where anger is the only emotion that is actively encouraged, where hatred of the other is considered a virtue, where violence is the primary tool of governance, it is not surprising that some individuals take the next logical step and begin channeling their rage toward the entity that embodies it most completely. The Imperium does not create chaos. Chaos exists independently, a product of the emotions of all sentient life in the galaxy. But the Imperium creates the conditions in which chaos thrives, in which its promises seem attractive, in which its corruption finds easy purchase. The Imperium is a greenhouse for the very weeds it claims to be eradicating, and every attempt it makes to pull those weeds only scatters their seeds more widely. This self-fulfilling quality extends to the Imperium's very identity. The Imperium defines itself through its enemies. It is the bulwark against chaos, the shield against the alien, the sword of the Emperor. Without those enemies, the Imperium has no purpose, no justification for its existence, and so, whether consciously or unconsciously, the Imperium ensures that those enemies persist. It feeds chaos through its oppression. It creates alien hostility through its xenophobia. It breeds rebellion through its tyranny. The enemies of the Imperium are, in a very real sense, our products of the Imperium itself. And this is the deepest, most uncomfortable truth about the Imperium of man. It does not want the war to end. It cannot afford for the war to end. If peace ever came to the galaxy, if the threats that justify the Imperium's existence were ever truly eliminated, the entire structure would collapse. The ecclesiarchy needs heretics to justify its power. The Inquisition needs conspiracies to justify its authority. The Astra Militarum needs enemies to justify its existence. The Administratum needs crisis to justify its bloated bureaucracy. Every institution within the Imperium is invested in the continuation of the very conditions that it claims to be fighting against. The Imperium is not at war because the galaxy is dangerous. The galaxy is dangerous, in no small part, because the Imperium is at war. This is the engine that drives the grim darkness of the far future. This is the cycle that ensures there will only ever be war. And this is why the Imperium of man is not merely a participant in the galaxy's horrors, but is, in a fundamental and inescapable way, their architect. Part 10. The Devil's Advocate. It would be dishonest to present the argument against the Imperium without also presenting the argument in its defense, because that argument exists. and it is not without merit. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is genuinely one of the most hostile environments in all of fiction, and the threats facing humanity are not imaginary, not exaggerated, and not the product of imperial propaganda. They are real, they are present, and they are constantly pressing inward from every direction. Let us be fair to the Imperium and consider the case for the defense. The Orcs. The Greenskins are a species engineered for one purpose: war. They are a biological weapon, originally created by the Old Ones millions of years ago, that has been running unchecked ever since its creators fell. Orcs reproduce through spores, which means that any world that has been touched by an orc invasion will continue to produce orcs for centuries after the initial invaders have been defeated. A single orc spore, drifting on the wind, can seed an entire planetary infestation. Orcs grow stronger through fighting, and the more they fight, the larger, tougher, and more dangerous they become. Their largest war leaders, beings like Gazkul Thraka, command hordes numbering in the billions, and possess a combination of raw physical power and crude strategic cunning that can overwhelm even the most prepared defenses. There is no negotiating with orcs. There is no reasoning with them. They fight because fighting is what they are. The Tyranids. The Great Devourer is perhaps the most existential threat the galaxy has ever faced. The Tyranid hive fleets are not an army in any conventional sense. They are a biological apocalypse, vast swarms of bioengineered organisms, directed by a collective intelligence of incomprehensible scope, driven by a single imperative: consume all organic matter. The Tyranids do not want territory. They do not want resources in any form other than biomass. They do not want to negotiate, to trade, or to coexist. They want to eat everything. Every living thing on every world in the galaxy, reduced to raw biological material and absorbed into the swarm. And the fleets that have reached the galaxy so far may be merely the advanced scouts of a much larger force that is still on its way. The forces of chaos. The warp is real. Demons are real. The chaos gods are real. They want to corrupt, consume, and destroy every sentient being in the galaxy, and they have been pursuing that goal for longer than humanity has existed. Chaos corruption is insidious and relentless, capable of subverting even the strongest wills, capable of rotting civilizations from the inside out. The Horus heresy, in which half of the Emperor's own primarchs were turned against him by chaos, demonstrated that no one, absolutely no one, is immune to its influence. The Eye of Terror, the Great Rift, the countless warp storms and demonic incursions that plague the galaxy. These are not metaphorical threats. They are physical realities that kill billions of people every year. The Necrons, an ancient civilization of soulless machines whose tomb worlds are scattered across the galaxy, awakening one by one to find that the galaxy they once ruled has been claimed by younger, weaker species. The Necrons possess technology so far beyond anything the Imperium can muster that direct military confrontation is often futile. Their leader, the Silent King, has seen threats from beyond the galaxy that dwarf anything the current inhabitants can imagine, and his plans for dealing with those threats may not include the continued existence of humanity. And beyond these major threats, there are countless minor ones. Chaos cults that spring up like weeds in human worlds, preparing them for Tyranid consumption. Genestealer cults that infiltrate and subvert human worlds from within, preparing them for Tyranid consumption. Chaos cults that spring up like weeds in any society where human emotions exist. Rogue psychers, whose uncontrolled powers can tear holes in reality and invite demonic invasion. The galaxy is genuinely, objectively, terrifyingly dangerous. Given all of this, the defender of the Imperium would argue, what alternative exists? A democratic government could not respond to the scale and speed of the threats facing humanity. A liberal society could not enforce the kind of discipline needed to maintain vigilance against chaos corruption. A tolerant civilization could not protect itself against aliens who view tolerance as weakness. Now, the Imperium is harsh, yes. It is oppressive, yes. It is cruel, yes, but it is also the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. This argument has force. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is not a place where the principles of liberal democracy or humanistic philosophy can be straightforwardly applied. The threats are too great, too numerous, and too fundamentally incompatible with human survival for any gentle approach to governance to work. But, and this is the crucial but, the defense of the Imperium assumes that the only possible responses to these threats are the ones the Imperium has chosen, and that assumption is false. The Imperium's response to the threat of chaos is to suppress all knowledge of chaos, punish anyone who encounters it, and maintain a civilization so steeped in suffering that it constantly generates the emotional energy that chaos feeds upon. An alternative response might involve educating the population about the nature of chaos, teaching them to recognize and resist its influence, and creating social conditions that reduce the despair and resentment that make chaos worship attractive. The Imperium has never tried this approach because it would require trusting its citizens with dangerous knowledge, and the Imperium does not trust its citizens. The Imperium's response to the threat of alien aggression is to adopt a policy of universal xenophobia and attempt to exterminate all non-human intelligent life. An alternative response might involve differentiating between genuinely hostile species and those that could be negotiated with, and never tried this approach because it would require acknowledging that aliens are not inherently inferior, and the Imperial Creed does not permit such acknowledgement. The Imperium's response to the threat of technological obsolescence is to ban all innovation and worship ancient designs as sacred. An alternative response might involve carefully controlled research programs that develop new technologies while maintaining strict safeguards against the dangers of artificial intelligence. The Imperium has never tried this approach because it would require the Adeptus Mechanicus to abandon its religious framework and embrace empirical science, and the Mechanicus views empirical science as heresy. At every turn, the Imperium has chosen the most extreme, the most cruel and the most counterproductive response to the challenges it faces, and then pointed to the continued existence of those challenges as proof that its extreme responses are necessary. This is circular reasoning of the most dangerous kind. The Imperium's policies create the conditions that produce the threats that justify those policies. The cure is the disease, and the disease is the cure, and both feed on each other in an endless cycle of suffering and destruction. The Tau Empire, for all its own problems and moral ambiguities, demonstrates that a different approach is possible. The Tau have faced many of the same threats that the Imperium faces, on a smaller scale, and have responded with a combination of diplomacy, innovation, and targeted military force that has allowed them to not only survive, but thrive. The Tau are not perfect. Their society has its own forms of control and manipulation. But they have proven that it is possible to build a functional civilization in the Warhammer 40,000 universe without resorting to the wholesale dehumanization of your own people. The Imperium's defenders would argue that the Tau are too small and too young to serve as a meaningful example, that they have not yet faced the kinds of existential threats that the Imperium has been grappling with for 10 millennia. And this is a fair point. But it is also an argument from ignorance, an assertion that because the Tau have not yet been tested to the breaking point, they inevitably will be, and will inevitably fail. The Imperium has decided, without evidence, that there is no alternative to its methods, and it has systematically destroyed or suppressed every attempt to prove otherwise. The most damning indictment of the Imperium is not that it does terrible things. It is that it has stopped asking whether those terrible things are actually working. 10,000 years of planetary-scale purges have not eliminated chaos. 10,000 years of xenocidal campaigns have not made the galaxy safe for humanity. 10,000 years of technological stagnation have not preserved the Imperium's military edge. 10,000 years of religious control have not produced a more faithful or more resilient population. By any objective measure, the Imperium's methods are failing. The Imperium is not winning its endless war. It is slowly, steadily losing it, It ground down by the accumulated weight of its own dysfunction, its enemies growing stronger while its resources dwindle and its capabilities decline. And yet the Imperium refuses to consider the possibility that its methods might be the problem, because to do so would be to admit that 10,000 years of suffering was not just tragic, but pointless. That is the real horror of the Imperium, not the individual atrocities, however terrible they are, but the refusal to learn, the refusal to change, the refusal to even ask whether there might be a better way. The Imperium is a civilization that has chosen to die slowly rather than risk the uncertainty of trying to live differently, and it is dragging the rest of humanity down with it. At Part 11, Guilliman's Reckoning. There is a moment in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 that captures everything we have been discussing in a single, devastating scene. When the Primarch Robot Guilliman was resurrected at the end of the 41st Millennium, after 10,000 years in stasis, he returned to find an Imperium that was almost unrecognizable from the one he had helped build. And his reaction tells us everything we need to know about how far the Imperium has fallen. Guilliman was one of the Emperor's 20 Primarchs, the genetically engineered superhuman sons created to lead the Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade. He was the architect of the Codex Astartes, the document that reorganized the Space Marine legions after the Horus Heresy. He was the Lord Commander of the Imperium, yet the man who held the realm together during the darkest days, following the Emperor's interment on the Golden Throne. He was, by any measure, one of the greatest administrators and statesmen the Imperium had ever produced, and when he woke up and saw what his civilization had become, he was horrified. Guilliman had helped build an Imperium founded on the imperial truth, on reason and science, and the rejection of superstition. He returned to find a theocracy, a civilization that worshipped his father as a god, and viewed any deviation from religious orthodoxy as a crime punishable by death. He had helped build an Imperium that aspired to human progress and technological advancement. He returned to find a civilization that had not only stopped advancing, but was actively regressing, its knowledge diminishing with every passing century. Yet he had helped build an Imperium that was meant to serve humanity. He returned to find a civilization that consumed humanity as fuel for its own perpetuation. In the novels that chronicle his return, Guilliman is depicted as a man caught between duty and despair. He sees the suffering. He understands the dysfunction. He recognizes that the Imperium has become almost exactly the kind of totalitarian nightmare that the Emperor had originally set out to prevent. But he also recognizes that he cannot simply dismantle the existing order, because the existing order, for all its flaws, is the only thing preventing the complete collapse of human civilization. So Guilliman does what he can. He launches the Indomitus Crusade to reclaim worlds lost to the Great Rift. He introduces Primaris Space Marines, a new generation of enhanced warriors, to reinforce the Imperium's depleted military. He attempts to reform the most egregious abuses of power within the imperial bureaucracy. He tries to drag the Imperium, kicking and screaming, towards something slightly less terrible. But even Guilliman, with all his superhuman intellect and all the authority of his name, can barely move the needle. The institutions of the Imperium resist reform, with a stubbornness born of 10,000 years of entrenched power. The ecclesiarchy opposes any suggestion that the emperor might not be a god. The Mechanicus opposes any suggestion that innovation might be permissible. The Inquisition opposes any relaxation of its authority. The Administratum, vast and slow and utterly indifferent to external pressure, simply absorbs Guilliman's reforms like a swamp absorbing rainwater, thus letting them seep in without ever changing the fundamental character of the landscape. And Guilliman himself is trapped by the very system he is trying to reform. He is the Lord Commander of the Imperium, but his authority exists within a structure that was designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power. The High Lords of Terror, who have been running the Imperium in their own interest for millennia, have no intention of surrendering their privileges to a resurrected Primarch, no matter how venerable his lineage. The various adepta, each jealous of its own prerogatives, cooperate with Guilliman's reforms only insofar as those reforms do not threaten their own power. Guilliman's return is often portrayed in the lore as a moment of hope, a sign that the Imperium might yet be saved from its own worst tendencies. Of the Emperor's own bloodline, dedicated to the genuine improvement of human civilization, and even he cannot fix the Imperium. The system is too vast, too entrenched, too deeply committed to its own dysfunction to be reformed by any individual, no matter how powerful. If Guilliman cannot save the Imperium from itself, who can? The answer, the lore seems to suggest, is nobody. The Imperium is not a system that can be fixed. It is a system that must be endured, and eventually, inevitably, it will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The only question is whether something better can be built from the ruins, or whether the collapse of the Imperium will drag humanity into extinction along with it. This is the final, awful truth about the Imperium of man. It is not merely a flawed institution that could be improved with better leadership or wiser policies. It is a fundamentally broken system whose very structure ensures that it will always tend toward greater cruelty, greater oppression, and greater dysfunction. The forces that maintain the Imperium, its religious fanaticism, its militaristic culture, its bureaucratic inertia, its technological stagnation, are not bugs in the system. They are the system, and they cannot be removed without destroying the Imperium itself. The Imperium survives not because it is strong, but because the galaxy is so dangerous that even a dysfunctional civilization is better than no civilization at all, as stumbles on, bleeding from 1,000 stumbles on, bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds, consuming its own children to keep itself alive for one more day, one more year, one more millennium. And the truly terrible thing, the thing that makes the Imperium the most effective piece of speculative fiction ever created, is that you cannot entirely condemn it. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, in a galaxy where literal gods of suffering hunger for human souls, where alien horrors beyond counting press against humanity's borders, where the fabric of reality itself is being torn apart by forces that no human mind can fully comprehend, what would you do differently? It is easy, from the comfort of our world, but in our time, to look at the Imperium and declare it monstrous. But the Imperium was not built in comfort. It was built in desperation, by people facing threats that would make our worst nightmares seem pleasant. The original architects of the Imperium were not villains seeking power for its own sake. They were survivors, trying to keep the human race alive in an environment that was actively trying to kill it. The tragedy is not that they built the Imperium. The tragedy is that the Imperium became the very thing they were trying to protect humanity from. The cure became the disease, the shield became the prison, the salvation became the damnation. And 10,000 years later, the prison keeps getting smaller, and the bars keep getting stronger, and the inmates keep dying. And nobody, not the priests, not the soldiers, not the bureaucrats, not even the returned son of the Emperor himself, can find the key. Part 12. The Mirror in the Darkness. So where does all of this leave us? We have walked through the corridors of the Imperium, past the altars stained with the blood of sacrificed psychers, past the manufactorums, where workers toil until they drop and are recycled into the food supply, past the cathedrals where blind faith is imposed with fire and sword, past the inquisitorial chambers where entire worlds are condemned at the stroke of a pen, past the battlefields where trillions of ordinary human beings are fed into the war machine's insatiable maw. We have seen the Imperium as it truly is, not the heroic bastion of humanity depicted in the propaganda, but a civilization that has become its own worst enemy. A civilization that generates the very threats it claims to protect against. A civilization that consumes its own people to sustain a system that is slowly, inexorably failing. A civilization that has forgotten what it was supposed to be fighting for. And the answer to the question we asked at the beginning, is the Imperium the real threat in Warhammer 40,000? The answer is yes. But it is a qualified yes. A complicated yes. A yes that does not let anyone else off the hook, but that demands we look at the Imperium with clearer eyes than its propaganda would prefer. The Imperium is not the only threat in the galaxy. The Tyranids are coming. Chaos is eternal. The Orcs will never stop fighting. The Necrons are awakening. These threats are real. They are serious. And they would exist whether the Imperium conducted itself humanely or not. But the Imperium amplifies every one of these threats through its own actions. It feeds chaos through the suffering of its people. It draws the Tyranids through the Astronomicon. It creates enemies among alien species that might otherwise be neutral or even friendly. It breeds rebellion through oppression and heresy through hopelessness. And it weakens itself through technological stagnation, bureaucratic incompetence, and the systematic destruction of the very human potential that might one day find a way out of the darkness. The Imperium is not just fighting a war against external enemies, it is fighting a war against itself, and it is losing both. Games Workshop, the company that created Warhammer 40,000, has been explicit about this. In their own words, the Imperium is not meant to be seen as heroic. It is a villain protagonist, the lesser evil in a galaxy of greater evils, but an evil nonetheless. The fascistic aesthetics, the totalitarian governance, the religious fanaticism, the industrial-scale cruelty. All of these are deliberate, designed to make the point that in a universe where there is only war, even the good guys are monsters. And that is perhaps the most valuable thing about the Imperium as a piece of fiction. It holds up a mirror to our own world, not a literal mirror, not a direct allegory, but a distorted reflection that asks uncomfortable questions about the relationship between security and freedom, between survival and humanity, between the threat of the other and the danger of the self. We live in a world where the fear of external threats is constantly used to justify internal repression, where the specter of the enemy is invoked to silence dissent, to restrict liberty, to consolidate power, where the language of protection is used to build systems of control, where the supposed necessity of security is used to erode the very values that make civilization worth protecting. The Imperium of man is what happens when these tendencies are taken to their absolute extreme, when the fear of the enemy becomes so overwhelming that the response to that fear becomes more destructive than the enemy itself, when the cure becomes so poisonous that the patient would have been better off with the disease. It is a warning, wrapped in power armor and written in the blood of billions. And perhaps that warning is worth more than all the bolter fire and chainsword swings in the galaxy. Perhaps the greatest gift that the Imperium of man offers us is not the thrill of its endless wars or the spectacle of its impossible battles, but the quiet, uncomfortable realization that the greatest enemy we will ever face might not come from outside. It might come from within, from the choices we make in the name of survival, from the compromises we accept in the name of security, from the humanity we sacrifice in the name of preserving the species. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But the war that matters most is not the one fought with guns and swords. It is the war fought within the soul of civilization itself, the war between what we must do to survive and what we must never do if survival is to have any meaning. The Imperium has already lost that war, but we have not yet. And as long as we can look at the Imperium of man and recognize it for what it is, as long as we can see the horror behind the glory and the cruelty behind the ceremony, as long as we can understand that there is always a better way, even when the darkness seems absolute, then perhaps the grim darkness of the far future can teach us something about the light we still carry in the present. That is the real story of the Imperium, not the story of heroism and sacrifice that the propaganda tells, but the story of what happens when a civilization stops asking whether its sacrifices are worth making, when it stops questioning whether its methods are achieving its goals, when it stops caring about the people it was created to serve. It is a story about the cost of power, the price of fear, and the terrible, seductive ease with which good intentions can be twisted into something unrecognizable. And it is the most important story that the grim darkness of the far future has to tell. But we are not done yet. There are still corners of this darkness that deserve illumination, still institutions and practices that reveal the full scope of the Imperium's assault on its own people. So let us continue deeper into the machinery of oppression. The Black Ships. A closer look. Those psychers who display too little power or more patience are discarded because the system prioritizes throughput over accuracy. The Golden Throne's hunger is constant, and the Black Ships must maintain a steady flow of sacrificial souls to keep the Astronomicon burning. There is no time for nuance. There is no room for mercy. The machine must be fed, and so they are fed into it. More one by one, day after day, year after year, millennium after millennium. Their names are not recorded, their faces are not remembered. Their lives, whatever they might have been, whatever potential they might have held, are reduced to a single function: fuel. They burn so that the Imperium might see, their screams swallowed by the ancient machinery of the throne, their consciousness consumed along with their psychic energy, erased from existence as thoroughly as if they had never been born. The Black Ships are not warships. They are not exploration vessels. They are not traders or diplomats or anything that might serve a constructive purpose. They are harvesters. They travel the galaxy collecting human beings the way a farmer collects grain, and they deliver their harvest to a machine that grinds it into power. This is not a metaphor, but this is the literal mechanical reality of how the Imperium keeps itself alive, and the scale of the operation is almost incomprehensible. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds. Each world contributes its quota of psychers. The Black Ships number in the thousands, each one capable of carrying hundreds or thousands of captives. The logistics of this operation, the record-keeping, the scheduling, the routing of ships through warp-infested space, the coordination with local authorities on 1,000,000 different planets, represent one of the most complex and resource-intensive undertakings in the entire Imperium. All of it dedicated to the collection and sacrifice of human beings. All of it running continuously, without pause, without interruption, without end. For 10,000 years. This is not defense. This is not protection. This is predation. Carried out by a civilization against its own citizens, justified by necessity and sanctified by faith, and so deeply woven into the fabric of imperial society that most people do not even question it. The Black Ships come, they take, and the galaxy goes on turning. It is simply how things are. It is simply how things have always been. And in the Imperium, the way things have always been is the closest thing to a moral argument that anyone is permitted to make. The Interrex and the road not taken. Among all the tragedies of the Great Crusade, the story of the Interrex stands out as perhaps the most poignant example of what the Imperium might have been and what it chose not to be. The Interrex were a human civilization that had survived the age of strife through intelligence, adaptability, and a willingness to learn from the world around them, including the non-human species that shared their region of space. Unlike the Imperium, which treated all alien life as an existential threat to be exterminated, the Interrex had developed a careful and principled approach to coexistence with other intelligent species. The Interrex did not submit to alien rule. They did not compromise their humanity or their independence. What they did was far more radical than that. They recognized that the galaxy was large enough for more than one intelligent species, and that cooperation between species could produce outcomes that none could achieve alone. They maintained their own military forces, their own government, their own culture, but they did so within a framework that allowed for peaceful relations with neighboring alien civilizations. But most importantly, the Interrex understood chaos. Not in the fragmentary, terrified way that the Imperium understood it, but in a deep, informed way that allowed them to actively defend against its influence. The Interrex knew about the Chaos Gods. They knew about the warp. They knew about the dangers of demonic corruption. And instead of burying this knowledge under layers of secrecy and prohibition, as the Imperium did, they taught it to their citizens. They educated their people about the nature of the threat, trained them to recognize the signs of corruption, and built a society that was genuinely resilient against chaos influence. When the forces of the Great Crusade encountered the Interrex, there was a brief shining moment of possibility. Horus Lupercal himself, the future War Master, met with the Interrex leadership and was impressed by what he found. Here was a human civilization that had not only survived the long night, but had thrived, that had found ways to deal with threats that the Imperium was still struggling against, that had preserved knowledge and technologies that the Imperium had lost. Diplomacy began. Conversations were held. For a few precious days, it seemed possible that the Interrex might be peacefully integrated into the Imperium, their knowledge preserved, their methods studied, their examples serving as proof that there were alternatives to the Imperium's policy of total xenocide. But the forces of chaos, working through the corrupted first chaplain of the Wordbearers, Erebus, ensured that this possibility was destroyed. Erebus stole a powerful chaos artifact from the Interrex, as an act that was designed to provoke conflict between the two civilizations. The theft was blamed on the Imperium. Trust was shattered. War followed. And the Interrex, a civilization that had survived for millennia through wisdom and cooperation, was destroyed by the very Imperium that should have been their greatest ally. The destruction of the Interrex was not merely a military defeat. It was the destruction of an alternative. It was the elimination of proof that another way was possible. With the Interrex gone, there was no longer a living example of a human civilization that had found a different path, a better path, through the darkness of the galaxy. The Imperium could continue to insist that its methods were the only methods, that its cruelty was the only option, that its path was the only path. But because no one was left alive to prove otherwise. And that, perhaps, is the real crime. Not the killing, though the killing was terrible, but the destruction of hope, the elimination of the possibility that things could be different. The Imperium does not merely destroy its enemies, it destroys the very idea that alternatives to the Imperium exist. The Diasporex and crimes against solidarity. The Diasporex were another example of what the Imperium destroys in its relentless pursuit of conformity. They were a fleet-based civilization, a nomadic community of humans and aliens who had found each other during the darkest years of the long night and had chosen to travel together through the stars, pooling their resources, sharing their knowledge, and protecting each other against the dangers of a hostile galaxy. The Diasporex were not a threat to anyone. They were survivors, refugees from the collapse of the old human civilization, who had found a way to keep going by building bonds of trust and cooperation across species lines. The humans of the Diasporex had not been conquered or enslaved by their alien companions. They had chosen to live alongside them, freely and willingly, because they recognized that together they were stronger than either group would have been alone. When the Iron Hands and Emperor's Children legions encountered the Diasporex, they offered the standard terms of imperial compliance: surrender, submit to imperial rule, and accept the Emperor as your sovereign. The Diasporex's human members were willing to discuss terms, but they refused to abandon their alien companions. Yet they would not betray the beings who had helped them survive the long night, who had shared their food and their knowledge and their protection during the worst years of human history. For this loyalty, this basic human decency, the entire Diasporex fleet was hunted down and destroyed. The humans were treated as traitors for refusing to abandon their friends. The aliens were exterminated as a matter of course. The fleet that had survived the age of strife, that had proven that cooperation between species was possible and beneficial, that had carried within it knowledge and perspectives that the Imperium desperately needed, was scattered across the void as wreckage and ash. The message was unmistakable. In the Imperium, loyalty to anyone or anything other than the Emperor is treason. Friendship with aliens is a capital offense. But the bonds of trust and mutual aid that hold communities together are, in the eyes of the Imperium, chains to be broken, weaknesses to be exploited, heresies to be burned. The penal legions and redemption through death. The concept of penal legions deserves examination because it reveals how the Imperium has weaponized even its own justice system. In the Imperium, criminals who are not executed or turned into servitors are often given a third option, the penal legion. These are military units composed entirely of convicted criminals, political prisoners, and other undesirables, armed with whatever equipment is available, often substandard, and sent into the most dangerous combat zones in the Imperium. The theoretical justification is that service in a penal legion offers criminals a chance at redemption through sacrifice. In practice, penal legions are suicide units. They are deployed as cannon fodder, sent in first to absorb enemy fire before the regular forces advance. They are used to clear minefields by walking through them. They are assigned to holding actions where survival is not expected. Their commanders are typically commissars, who maintain discipline through summary execution, and who view the penal legionnaires not as soldiers to be led, but as ammunition to be expended. The criteria for assignment to a penal legion are, like most things in the Imperium, elastic enough to encompass almost anything. Genuine criminals, murderers, thieves, and deserters make up a portion of the ranks, but so do political prisoners, religious dissenters, people who spoke out against their local governor, people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, people who attracted the attention of the Inquisition for reasons that may or may not have been justified. The penal legion system transforms the Imperium's justice system into a military resource pipeline. Every criminal sentence, every political arrest, every inquisitorial purge produces a supply of bodies that can be fed into the war machine. The system creates a perverse incentive for the Imperium to maintain high rates of criminalization, because every criminal is a potential soldier, and the Imperium's wars always need more soldiers. This is justice as consumption. This is law as a feeding mechanism for the war machine, and it is one more way in which the Imperium devours its own citizens, extracting value from them even in their punishment, ensuring that no human life goes to waste. Even if waste is defined as anything other than dying in service to the Emperor. The Schola Progenium and the manufacture of zealots. The Schola Progenium is the Imperium's network of orphan schools, institutions that raise the children of deceased imperial servants, including guardsmen, commissars, administratum officials, and other functionaries who died in the line of duty. On the surface, the Schola Progenium seems almost benevolent, a system that provides for children who would otherwise have no one to care for them. In reality, the Schola Progenium is one of the most effective indoctrination machines in the Imperium. Children are taken in at the youngest possible age and raised in an environment of absolute imperial orthodoxy. Their education is a carefully designed program of physical training, academic instruction, and psychological conditioning that produces some of the Imperium's most fanatical and capable servants. Graduates of the Schola Progenium go on to become commissars, stormtroopers, sisters of battle, inquisitors, and high-ranking administratum officials. They are the Imperium's elite, its most trusted and most capable operatives. And they are, to a person, the products of institutional upbringing that stripped them of their individual identities and replaced those identities with total devotion to the imperial creed. The children of the scholar do not choose to serve the Imperium. They are shaped, from their earliest memories, to be incapable of imagining any other way of life. Their loyalty is not the product of conviction or personal choice, but it is the product of systematic conditioning that began before they were old enough to understand what was being done to them. This is not education. It is manufacturing. The Schola Progenium does not produce citizens. It produces components, human parts, designed to fit specific slots in the imperial machine. The children who enter the schola as individuals leave it as instruments, their personal desires, their doubts, their questions, their capacity for independent thought, all carefully excised and replaced with duty, obedience, and faith. And the Imperium considers this a kindness. These are orphans, after all. Without the schola, they would have nothing. The Imperium gives them purpose, gives them belonging, gives them a place in the divine order. All it asks in return is everything that makes them human. So the Armageddon precedent. The Imperial response to the First War for Armageddon provides one of the most disturbing case studies in Imperial governance. After the forces of chaos, led by the demon Primarch Angron, invaded the hive world of Armageddon, the combined forces of the Space Wolves, Grey Knights, and Astra Militarum fought a desperate campaign to drive them back. The war was eventually won, at tremendous cost, and the forces of chaos were repelled. But the Imperium's treatment of the surviving population of Armageddon after the war was arguably worse than anything chaos had done during it. The Inquisition determined that the civilian population of Armageddon, which had witnessed the demonic invasion and the deployment of Grey Knights, those secretive space marines specifically designed to fight demons, possessed dangerous knowledge. The existence of demons is one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets, and the Inquisition could not allow millions of people to walk around with first-hand knowledge of demonic entities. The solution was mass sterilization and forced labor. The surviving civilian population of Armageddon was rounded up, sterilized to prevent them from passing their tainted knowledge to future generations, and relocated to forced labor camps, where they would spend the rest of their lives under constant inquisitorial surveillance, working until they dropped and then being disposed of. The Space Wolves, who had fought alongside the people of Armageddon and considered the Inquisition's treatment of them to be dishonorable and unjust, protested vigorously. Yet the resulting conflict between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition, known as the Months of Shame, nearly escalated into a full-scale civil war before a compromise was reached. But the compromise did not save the people of Armageddon. They were still sterilized. They were still relocated. They were still worked to death in camps designed to ensure that no one who had witnessed the truth of chaos could ever pass that knowledge on. These were loyal Imperial citizens. They had not chosen to encounter demons. They had not sought out forbidden knowledge. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, living on a world that happened to be attacked by forces beyond their comprehension or control. And for this accident of geography, the Imperium punished them with a slow death in forced labor camps. This is the Imperium's idea of protecting its people, not protecting them from danger, but protecting them from knowledge. Because in the Imperium's view, a population that knows the truth is more dangerous than a population that has been sterilized and worked to death. Knowledge is the enemy. Ignorance is the shield. And if the shield must be forged from the bodies of loyal citizens, so be it. The lost and the damned, forgotten worlds. One of the most quietly horrifying aspects of the Imperium is the phenomenon of lost worlds, planets that have simply fallen off the Administratum's records and been forgotten by the government that claims sovereignty over them. The Imperium spans 1 million worlds, and the bureaucracy responsible for managing them is, as we have discussed, staggeringly inefficient. Records are lost, misfiled, or destroyed. Communication through the warp is unreliable, with messages sometimes arriving decades or centuries after they were sent, if they arrive at all. Entire planetary systems can be cut off from the rest of the Imperium by warp storms, sometimes for centuries at a time. When a world is lost, it is lost completely. There is no search and rescue. There is no effort to re-establish contact. The world simply ceases to exist in the Imperium's records, and its population is left to fend for itself against whatever threats emerge. Some lost worlds are eventually rediscovered, sometimes centuries later, and brought back into compliance with Imperial law. The populations of these worlds, who may have developed their own cultures, governments, and religions during the intervening centuries, are typically forced to abandon everything they have built and submit to Imperial orthodoxy, often at gunpoint. Others are never rediscovered. They exist in a kind of limbo, technically part of the Imperium, but receiving none of its protections, subject to whatever dangers the galaxy throws at them, while the government that should be defending them does not even know they exist. The fact that the Imperium can simply lose entire worlds, with their populations of millions or billions, and not notice tells you everything you need to know about how much value the Imperium places on human life. These are not uninhabited asteroids being lost in the shuffle. These are inhabited planets, communities, civilizations, falling through the cracks of a bureaucracy so bloated and so dysfunctional that it cannot keep track of the people it claims to rule. And when these worlds are rediscovered, the Imperium does not apologize. It does not acknowledge that it failed them. It simply reasserts its authority, demands the imperial tithe, and punishes any deviation from orthodoxy that may have developed during the centuries of neglect. The message is clear. The Imperium owns you, whether it remembers you or not. Your loyalty is expected regardless of whether the Imperium has done anything to earn it. The absence of art, culture, and the human spirit. There is one final aspect of imperial life that deserves attention, because it speaks to the totality of the Imperium's assault on the human spirit. In the Imperium, art, music, literature, and culture exist, but they exist almost exclusively within the framework of the imperial cult. All forms of creative expression are monitored by the ecclesiarchy and are expected to serve the purposes of devotion and propaganda. Music is limited to hymns and military marches. Literature is restricted to religious texts, approved histories, and propaganda. Visual art depicts the emperor, his saints, and the glories of the Imperium. Theatre, dance, and other forms of performance are channeled toward religious festivals and state celebrations. Independent creative expression, art for its own sake, is viewed with suspicion at best and hostility at worst. On many worlds, the only form of recreation available to the common citizen is worship. Religious services serve as the primary social gathering, the primary form of entertainment, and the primary outlet for emotional expression. Everything else, the full spectrum of human creativity and imagination, is either restricted, regulated, or forbidden. This is not an incidental detail. It is central to the Imperium's character. A civilization that suppresses creative expression is a civilization that fears the human mind. It is a civilization that understands, on some level, that a population capable of independent thought, of imagining alternatives, of expressing dissatisfaction through art rather than violence, is a population that is more difficult to control. The Imperium has built a world without beauty, without wonder, without the consolation of art. It has taken the one thing that makes human suffering bearable, the capacity to create meaning through creative expression, and it has locked it away behind the walls of the ecclesiarchy, dispensing it only in approved doses and approved forms. And the people of the Imperium endure this, as they endure everything else, because they have been told that beauty is frivolous, that wonder is dangerous, that the only acceptable form of meaning is devotion to the emperor. They have been taught to fear their own imaginations, to suspect their own desires, to view any impulse that does not serve the Imperium as a potential opening for chaos corruption. They live, they work, they pray, and they die, and in between, there is nothing. No music that makes the heart soar, no story that opens the mind to possibilities, no image that captures the sublime. Just the grinding routine of labor and worship repeated endlessly, until the body gives out and the remains are processed into nutrient paste for the next generation. This is the final cruelty, the one that encompasses all the others. The Imperium does not merely exploit the human body. It does not merely imprison the human mind. It has reached into the deepest part of the human soul, the part that reaches for beauty and meaning and connection, and it has cut that part away. It has created a civilization of hollow people, people who are alive in the biological sense, but who have been denied everything that makes life worth living. And it calls this survival. It calls this the Emperor's will. It calls this the price of endurance in a galaxy that offers nothing but war. But survival without meaning is not survival. It is merely the continuation of biological processes in the absence of everything that gives those processes purpose. It is existence without life. It is endurance without hope. It is the grim darkness of the far future, and it is the Imperium of man's greatest achievement and its most unforgivable crime. The Imperium endures, but the question that echoes through the corridors of its hive cities, through the cathedrals of its shrine worlds, through the trenches of its endless battlefields, is the question that no commissar can silence and no ecclesiarchy preacher can answer. Is this endurance worth the cost? After everything we have seen, after all the blood and all the suffering and all the humanity that has been sacrificed on the altar of survival, I think the answer is clear. The Imperium of man is the real threat in Warhammer 40,000. And not because it is the most powerful enemy, or the most alien, or the most inherently malevolent, but because it is the one threat that humanity could actually do something about. The Tyranids cannot be reasoned with, chaos cannot be reformed, the orcs cannot be civilized, but the Imperium is made of human beings, governed by human decisions, sustained by human choices, and every one of those choices could be made differently. The fact that they are not, the fact that they have not been for 10,000 years, the fact that even a returned Primarch cannot turn the ship, is the darkest thing in the entire setting. Not because it is fantastical, but because it is familiar. Because we have seen in our own history what happens when civilizations choose fear over hope, control over freedom, survival at any cost over life with meaning. But the Imperium of man is a mirror, and what it shows us about ourselves is far more frightening than any demon or Xenos horror could ever be, and the mirror has many more facets still to examine. The High Lords and the corruption of governance. At the very summit of the Imperium's power structure sit the High Lords of Terror, a council of 12 individuals who govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name. In theory, the High Lords represent the pinnacle of imperial authority, the wisest and most capable leaders that humanity has to offer, entrusted with the sacred duty of steering civilization through the endless perils of the galaxy. In practice, the High Lords are a collection of political animals whose primary concern is the preservation and expansion of their own power. The Council is riven by factional rivalries, personal vendettas, and institutional jealousies that consume far more of its attention than the actual governance of the Imperium. The Master of the Administratum schemes against the Fabricator General of Mars. The Ecclesiarch maneuvers against the Inquisitorial Representative. The Lord Commander Militant of the Imperial Guard competes for resources with the Lord High Admiral of the Imperial Navy. And all of them, without exception, view any attempt to reform the system as a threat to their personal position. The composition of the Council is itself revealing. 9 of the 12 seats are permanent, reserved for specific offices within the imperial government. The remaining 3 seats rotate among various minor organizations, creating a constant political game as factions vie for the prestige and influence that comes with a seat on the Council. The result is a governing body that spends as much time managing internal politics as it does addressing external threats. A body where the ability to outmaneuver your colleagues is valued more highly than the ability to defend the Imperium against its enemies. The High Lords have presided over some of the most catastrophic failures in Imperial history, not through malice, but through sheer institutional paralysis. During the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, when an Orc empire of unprecedented size and sophistication threatened to overrun the Imperium, the High Lords were so consumed by internal bickering that they nearly failed to mount an effective response. It took the direct intervention of the last surviving Imperial Fist, Maximus Thane, to galvanize the Council into action, and even then, the response was delayed by political infighting that cost millions of lives. The High Lords did not learn from this near catastrophe. They continued to prioritize their own political survival over the defense of the Imperium, continued to treat the governance of a galaxy-spanning civilization as a game to be won rather than a responsibility to be fulfilled. When Robert Guilliman returned and assumed the title of Lord Commander, many of the High Lords viewed him not as a savior, but as a threat to their established order, and they worked to undermine his authority, even as the Imperium faced its greatest crisis since the Horus heresy. This is governance by committee at its absolute worst. 12 individuals with irreconcilable interests, locked in an eternal struggle for dominance, are theoretically responsible for the welfare of quadrillions of human beings, but practically focused on the narrow concerns of their own institutional survival. The High Lords do not serve the Imperium, they serve themselves, and the Imperium persists in spite of their leadership, not because of it. The irony is that this system was designed, intentionally, to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power. After the Horus heresy, the architects of the reformed Imperium created a system of checks and balances specifically intended to ensure that no one person could ever again threaten the Imperium from within. The result is a system where no one person can effectively lead the Imperium either. A government designed for stability that has achieved that stability at the cost of competence, adaptability, and basic human decency. The Astartes problem. Even the Space Marines, those iconic figures of the setting, those gleaming paragons of human potential, are part of the problem. Not in the way you might expect, not through deliberate cruelty or malicious intent, but through the very nature of what they are and what they represent. Space Marines are created through a process that takes young boys, children who have not yet reached adulthood, and subjects them to a series of surgeries, implantations, and psychological conditioning procedures that fundamentally alter their biology, their psychology, and their capacity for normal human experience. The process has a staggeringly high mortality rate. Depending on the chapter, there are anywhere from 50 to 95% of aspirants die during the transformation process, or are so damaged by it that they cannot be used as Space Marines and are instead relegated to serve as chapter serfs or, in some cases, servitors. The boys who survive emerge as something more than human, but also something less. They are faster, stronger, tougher, and more resilient than any baseline human could ever be. They can survive wounds that would kill a normal person 10 times over. They can operate in environments that would be instantly fatal to unaugmented humans. They are, by any physical measure, superior beings. But they have also been stripped of much that makes human life meaningful. They do not form families. They do not maintain personal relationships outside their chapter. They do not experience the full range of human emotions, their psychological conditioning specifically suppressing certain emotional responses that are considered detrimental to combat effectiveness. They do not age in the way that normal humans do. They do not participate in civilian society. They exist in a permanent state of martial readiness, separated from the humanity they are supposed to protect by a gulf of biology and experience that can never be bridged. The Space Marine chapters are, in effect, warrior monasteries, self-contained communities of genetically enhanced soldiers who view themselves as apart from, and in many cases above, the ordinary humans who make up the vast majority of the Imperium's population. Many Space Marines view baseline humans with something between condescension and indifference. They are the Emperor's angels, set apart by their genetic heritage and their sacred duty, and the concerns of ordinary people are, to them, trivially small. This creates a dynamic where the Imperium's most powerful military assets are also its most detached. Space Marines fight for humanity, but they do not live among humanity. They protect the Imperium, but they do not understand the Imperium as its citizens experience it. They are defenders who do not know what they are defending, warriors who have been engineered to fight, but not to understand what they are fighting for. And the process of creating them, the taking of children, and the transformation of those children into weapons, is itself one of the Imperium's great crimes. These are children who are selected, often without any meaningful consent from them or their families, and to be subjected to a process that will kill most of them and transform the survivors into something that is no longer fully human. The Imperium calls this an honor. The families whose children are taken sometimes call it the same, because to call it anything else would be heresy. But when you strip away the ritual and the rhetoric, what remains is a system that harvests children and processes them into weapons, and that is not an honor by any definition that a reasonable person would recognize. The astropathic choir and the cost of communication. Communication in the Imperium relies almost entirely on psychic transmission. Astropaths, psychers who have been soul-bound to the Emperor and whose eyes have been burned out in the process, serve as the Imperium's postal service, as transmitting and receiving psychic messages across interstellar distances. Without them, the Imperium could not coordinate its military forces, could not manage its bureaucracy, could not maintain any semblance of galactic governance. The process of creating an astropath is itself a form of sacrifice. The soul-binding ritual, in which a fraction of the Emperor's psychic power is channeled through the psyker, destroys their eyes and often inflicts other forms of permanent damage. Many psykers do not survive the process. Those who do are left blind, often physically frail, and bound to a life of service that offers little in the way of comfort or personal fulfillment. Astropaths serve in choirs, groups of psykers who combine their abilities to transmit and receive messages. The work is exhausting and dangerous. Psychic transmission through the warp exposes the astropath to the attention of warp entities, including daemons who may attempt to possess them or corrupt the messages they carry. Astropaths burn out with disturbing regularity, their minds consumed by the strain of their work or destroyed by encounters with hostile warp entities. The messages themselves are unreliable. Astropathic communication is closer to dreaming than to conversation, with messages transmitted as impressions, emotions, and symbolic images rather than clear text. Messages can be distorted by warp currents, misinterpreted by receiving astropaths, or simply lost in transmission. Critical communications sometimes arrive garbled, incomplete, or months or years late. This is the communication system upon which the entire Imperium depends. An unreliable, dangerous, yet psychically transmitted network that burns through human psychers like fuel, that produces messages that are as much poetry as information, and that can fail at any moment due to warp conditions that no one can predict or control. The fact that the Imperium functions at all with this as its primary means of communication is either a testament to human resilience or evidence that the universe has a deeply ironic sense of humor. And once again, the Imperium has made no serious effort to develop alternatives. The Eldar's Webway, a network of stable passages through the warp that allows instantaneous, reliable travel and communication, exists as proof that better systems are possible. But the Imperium's xenophobia prevents it from learning from the Eldar, and the Mechanicus's prohibition on innovation prevents it from developing its own solutions. So the astropaths burn, one after another, their minds consumed in the service of a communication system that barely works, and the Imperium stumbles on, half blind and half deaf, making decisions based on information that may be weeks, months, or years out of date, governing a galaxy it cannot see clearly through a fog of its own making. The weight of 10,000 years. Perhaps the most damning thing about the Imperium is not any single policy, not any individual atrocity, not any specific institution or practice. It is the sheer accumulated weight of 10,000 years of suffering, 10,000 years of choices that prioritized control over compassion, security over freedom, survival over meaning. 10,000 years is a long time. Yet for 10,000 years, the Imperium has for 10,000 years, the Imperium has been grinding away at the human spirit, wearing it down through monotony and misery, erosion and exhaustion, until what remains is barely recognizable as the species that once dreamed of reaching the stars. The people of the Imperium do not know what they have lost because they have never known anything else. They do not know that art could be free, that knowledge could be shared, that technology could advance. that governance could serve the governed, that life could have meaning beyond labor and worship and death. They cannot even imagine these things, because the Imperium has ensured that the very concepts are foreign to them. This is the ultimate victory of the Imperium's system of control. Not the suppression of rebellion, not the elimination of heresy, not the destruction of the alien, but the destruction of the capacity to imagine anything better. The people of the Imperium are not merely oppressed. They are incapable of recognizing their oppression because they have no framework within which to understand what is being done to them. They have been told that their suffering is sacred, that their labor is devotion, that their ignorance is protection, that their obedience is freedom. And they believe it, not because they are stupid, but because they have never been given the tools to believe anything else. This is the Imperium's greatest crime, greater than the sacrifice of psychers, greater than the creation of servitors, greater than the destruction of worlds. It has taken the most creative, the most curious, the most resilient species in the galaxy, and it has turned that species into something small and afraid and empty. It has taken a species that once dreamed of touching the stars and reduced it to a species that dreams of nothing at all. And the galaxy turns, and the wars go on, and the prayers rise unanswered to a God who cannot hear them. And the machine grinds forward, consuming everything in its path. And somewhere, in the deep halls of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor sits on his golden throne, trapped between life and death, sustained by the agony of thousands. And perhaps, if any fragment of his vast consciousness still retains the capacity for such things, he weeps, not for himself, not for his sons, ye lost or fallen, or waiting in the shadows, but for the species he tried to save, and the civilization that devoured them in his name, the navigator houses and aristocratic mutation. The navigators represent yet another dimension of the Imperium's complicated relationship with its own people. These are mutant humans, genetically altered to possess a third eye that allows them to perceive the currents of the warp and guide starships through its treacherous tides. Without navigators, the Imperium's ships would be unable to make the long-distance warp jumps that are essential to interstellar travel. The entire infrastructure of the Imperium, its military logistics, its trade routes, its communication networks, all depend on the services of these hereditary mutants. In any rational system, the navigators would be valued citizens, or are protected and respected for the essential service they provide. And in some ways, they are. The navigator houses are among the wealthiest and most politically powerful organizations in the Imperium, wielding influence that rivals that of the High Lords themselves. They live in luxury, surrounded by servants and retainers, their every need attended to. But this privilege comes with a terrible price. Navigators are mutants, and the Imperium's official position on mutation is extermination. The only reason navigators are tolerated is that they are useful, and the moment they cease to be useful, the protection afforded by their utility evaporates. Navigator families that produce too many non-functional mutations are purged. Individual navigators whose abilities degrade are quietly eliminated. But the navigator houses exist in a state of permanent conditional acceptance, tolerated because they serve a purpose, despised for what they are. The navigator's own biology reinforces their isolation. As generations pass, the navigator gene becomes increasingly dominant, producing individuals who are visibly and profoundly inhuman. Advanced generation navigators may have elongated skulls, vestigial limbs, translucent skin through which their organs are visible, or other mutations that make it impossible for them to pass as normal humans. Their third eye, if exposed to an unprotected individual, can cause madness, death, or worse. These are the people upon whom the entire Imperium depends. And the Imperium treats them with a mixture of grudging utility and barely concealed revulsion, using them when they are needed and pretending they do not exist when they are not. The navigators are living proof that the Imperium's absolutist stance on mutation is hypocrisy. The Imperium will tolerate any deviation, any corruption, any abomination, as long as it serves the Imperium's purposes. The principles are flexible. The pragmatism is absolute. And the navigators know this. They know that they are tolerated, not accepted. They know that their wealth and influence exist at the pleasure of an Imperium that could turn on them at any moment. They live with the constant awareness that they are one policy change, one shift in technology, one alternative to warp navigation away from extermination. This knowledge shapes their politics, their culture, their psychology. They are survivors, first and foremost, and everything they do is filtered through the imperative of survival in a civilization that would happily see them dead. Rogue traders and the contradiction of freedom. The rogue traders offer perhaps the clearest illustration of the Imperium's fundamental incoherence. These are individuals who have been granted a warrant of trade, a document signed by the Emperor himself or one of his designated representatives, that gives them permission to operate beyond the Imperium's borders. They can trade with alien species. They can explore uncharted space. They can establish colonies, negotiate treaties, and wage private wars, all in the name of expanding the Imperium's influence and enriching its coffers. In a civilization that preaches absolute obedience, total uniformity, and the extermination of all alien life, our rogue traders are a walking contradiction. They do everything that the Imperium tells its citizens is forbidden. They deal with aliens. They operate independently. They make their own decisions without reference to the administratum or the ecclesiarchy. And they do it with official sanction because the Imperium recognizes, on some level, that its own rules are too rigid to accomplish certain necessary tasks. The existence of rogue traders proves that the Imperium knows its own system does not work. It knows that absolute rigidity is incompatible with effective governance of a galaxy-spanning civilization. It knows that some degree of flexibility, some capacity for independent judgment, some tolerance for deviation from the official line is necessary for survival. But instead of reforming its system to incorporate this flexibility, yes, the Imperium creates exceptions, special individuals who are given permission to break the rules that everyone else must follow. This is governance by hypocrisy. The Imperium tells its citizens that obedience is the highest virtue, that deviation is heresy, that contact with aliens is a death sentence. And then it hands select individuals a piece of paper that says, "None of that applies to you," and sends them out to do all the things it tells everyone else are forbidden. The message could not be clearer. The rules are for the small people. The powerful are exempt. The Imperium's own policies are not universal principles, but tools of control, applied selectively to maintain the existing power structure. When the rules serve the interests of the powerful, they are enforced with lethal rigidity. When they do not, they are quietly set aside. The Departamento Munitorum and death by logistics. If the administratum is the Imperium's bureaucratic heart, then the Departamento Munitorum is the organ that pumps blood to the war machine, and it pumps that blood with all the precision of a drunk surgeon operating in the dark. The Munitorum is responsible for the logistics of the Astra Militarum, which means it handles the supply, deployment, transportation, and provisioning of the largest military force in the galaxy, and it does so with a level of incompetence that would be comical if the consequences were not measured in millions of lives. The stories of Munitorum failures are legendary within the lore, and each one carries its own particular flavor of bureaucratic horror. Regiments deployed to Arctic worlds without cold weather gear, as tropical jungle fighters sent to defend desert planets. Ammunition shipments arriving years after the battles they were intended for have already been fought and lost. Food supplies that are technically sufficient in caloric value, but consist entirely of a single nutritional paste that has been recycled so many times that its molecular structure is more philosophical concept than edible substance. The Munitorum once famously deployed an entire armored regiment to a world that did not exist. The planet had been destroyed by an exterminator's action decades earlier, but the records had not been updated. And so the regiment was loaded onto transports, shipped across the galaxy, and deposited in the void where a world had once been. By the time the error was discovered, the regiment had been floating in space for weeks, and the casualties from life support failures and morale collapse were significant. In another well-documented case, the Munitorum shipped 17 billion left boots to a war zone that had requested 17 billion pairs. The right boots were shipped separately to a completely different sector, where they sat in a warehouse for 14 years before anyone realized the error. By that time, the original war zone had fallen to the enemy, and the soldiers who had needed boots were all dead. These are not outliers. These are the system functioning as designed. The Munitorum processes such vast quantities of material across such enormous distances that errors are not merely possible, but inevitable. And the Munitorum's response to these errors is not to reform its systems, but to add more layers of bureaucracy, more forms to fill out, more approvals to obtain, more records to maintain, each new layer increasing the complexity of the system and the probability of further errors. Soldiers die because of paperwork. Campaigns fail because of filing errors. Worlds fall because someone transposed 2 digits on a requisition form. And the Munitorum keeps turning, keeps processing, keeps feeding bodies and bullets into the machine with the serene confidence of an institution that has never been held accountable for its failures and never expects to be. The Munitorum's relationship with the Imperial Guard's rank and file is particularly telling. To the scribes and adepts who staff the Munitorum's countless offices, the soldiers they supply are not people. They are line items on a ledger, numbers in a column, entries in a database that spans the galaxy. A regiment is not a community of human beings with names and families and fears and hopes. It is a unit of military capacity, measured in terms of combat effectiveness, attrition rates, and resource consumption. When a regiment is destroyed, the Munitorum's primary concern is not the loss of life, but the loss of investment. The resources that were expended in equipping, transporting, and supplying that regiment now show as a negative on the Munitorum's balance sheets, and somewhere, a mid-level adept will be required to explain the discrepancy to his superiors. The dead soldiers will not be mourned by the Munitorum. They will be audited. This reduction of human beings to accounting entries is not unique to the Munitorum. It is endemic to every institution in the Imperium. Loses a planet's records, the consequences are so directly and measurably fatal. When the Administratum loses a planet's records, the consequences may take decades to manifest. When the Munitorum loses a supply shipment, people starve to death within weeks. The Munitorum is the Imperium's logistics engine laid bare, and what it reveals about the Imperium's values is damning. The soldiers know this. Every guardsman who has ever waited for supplies that never came, who has fought with weapons that were meant for a different war zone, who has eaten rations that expired before their grandparents were born, understands on a visceral level what the Munitorum thinks of them. They are expendable, they are replaceable, they are material, and they serve anyway. They fight and they bleed and they die, and, knowing that the system that sent them to their deaths cannot even be bothered to send them the right ammunition. That is not heroism born of faith or devotion. That is heroism born of the absence of alternatives. They serve because the only other option is execution at the hands of a commissar. They fight because the Imperium has made sure there is nothing else they can do, and they die because in the end, that is what the Imperium designed them to do. The tragedy of the Thunder Warriors. Before we close, it is worth remembering the Thunder Warriors, because their story is the Imperium's original sin, the crime upon which everything else was built. The Thunder Warriors were the Emperor's first super soldiers, created to unite terror during the Wars of Unification. They were crude by later standards, yet their enhancements less refined than those of the Space Marines who would replace them, their lifespans shorter, their temperaments more volatile. But they were devastatingly effective, and they won the Emperor's wars for him, conquering the planet one bloody campaign at a time. And when the wars of unification were over, when Terra was united, and the Emperor no longer needed his Thunder Warriors, he had them killed. Not in battle, not through natural causes, but through deliberate, planned extermination. The Emperor created the Thunder Warriors, used them to achieve his goals, and then disposed of them when they were no longer useful. The official Imperial histories do not mention this. The Thunder Warriors have been erased from the record, their existence replaced by sanitized accounts of the Great Crusade's beginnings. But the Space Marines who replaced them were told nothing of their predecessors' fate. The galaxy at large has no idea that the Emperor's first great act was the creation and subsequent betrayal of an entire class of beings who had served him faithfully and at great personal cost. This is the foundation upon which the Imperium was built. Not justice, not honor, not the principles of loyalty and duty that the imperial creed endlessly extols, but pragmatic betrayal, the cold calculus of utility, the recognition that in the Emperor's vision, people are tools to be used and discarded as the moment demands. If the Emperor could do this to the warriors who won him Terra, what would he not do to the rest of humanity? The answer, as 10,000 years of imperial history have shown, is nothing. As long as it serves the purpose of keeping the machine running. The Thunder Warriors were the first victims of the Imperium's fundamental principle, that human beings exist to serve the system, and the system exists to perpetuate itself. They would not be the last. They are not even the most numerous. But they were the first, and in their fate we can see the blueprint for everything that followed. From the extermination of peaceful alien civilizations, to the sacrifice of psychers on the Golden Throne, from the creation of servitors, to the sterilization of Armageddon's survivors, the logic is the same. People are resources. Resources are expendable. And the Imperium's appetite is infinite. And yet, within this darkness, within this story of a civilization consuming itself, there is something worth noting. The very fact that we recoil from the Imperium's crimes, the fact that we recognize its atrocities as atrocities, the fact that the setting's creators designed it to provoke exactly this reaction, tells us something important about ourselves. The Imperium is a warning, not an aspiration. It is a mirror held up to the darkest possibilities of human civilization, a thought experiment about what happens when survival becomes the only value and every other consideration is sacrificed on that altar. The genius of Warhammer 40,000 as a setting is that it refuses to let us look away. It does not give us easy heroes or simple villains, and it does not allow us the comfort of believing that the Imperium's enemies are worse, and therefore the Imperium is justified. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that a civilization can be both humanity's defender and humanity's greatest enemy, that the price of survival can be so high that what survives is no longer worth saving. Every faction in the setting is monstrous in its own way. The Drukhari feast on suffering. The Tyranids devour biomass. Chaos corrupts the soul. The Necrons seek to extinguish all life. But the Imperium's monstrosity is unique because it is chosen. It is a monstrosity born not of alien biology or supernatural corruption or ancient programming, but of human decisions made by human beings in the name of human survival. And that makes it the most terrifying thing in the entire setting. Because it is the one horror that we can see reflected in our own world, in our own history, in our own capacity for cruelty, when we convince ourselves that cruelty is the only option. The Imperium of Man is not the hero of Warhammer 40,000. It is the tragedy. It is the proof that the darkness of the far future is not some external force pressing in on humanity from outside, but something that humanity has built for itself, brick by bloody brick, over 10,000 years of fear and suffering and willful blindness. And that is why the Imperium is the real threat, not because it is the strongest enemy or the most dangerous, but because it is the one enemy that humanity could have chosen not to create, and chose to create anyway. Oh, this has been the Imperium, the real threat in Warhammer 40,000. And I hope that somewhere in this long journey through the darkness, you found something that made you think, that challenged an assumption, that showed you a familiar universe from an unfamiliar angle. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of this community. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please do me the favor of hitting that like button and subscribing to Q on 40,000. Your support is what makes content like this possible, and I am endlessly grateful for every single one of you who takes the time to watch, to comment, and to share. Hit that notification bell so you are the first to know when the next video drops. Until we meet again in the grim darkness of the far future, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. The Emperor may or may not protect, but we can always protect one another. See you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.